Welcome, my fearless friends. In today's video, we unravel the twisted, nightmarish tale of Gideon Falls, a modern horror masterpiece written by horror visionary Jeff Lemire, with hauntingly beautiful artwork by Andrea Sorrentino. This chilling saga follows the intertwining lives of broken people, a cursed small town, and the ominous presence of the Black Barn, a mysterious structure that bridges realities, spreading terror and madness wherever it appears. Prepare to witness the unraveling of sanity as sinister forces pull the characters into a web of psychological horror, cryptic multiverses, and relentless dread. With its breathtaking visuals and gripping narrative, Gideon Falls is a visceral exploration of evil, obsession, and the fragile line between reality and delusion. Brace yourselves, as today's video will drag you through the depths of hell, where every page screams with horror, paranoia, and despair. But before we begin, we have a small request. If you like our content, please subscribe to our channel. It is a small click from you, but it means a lot to us. Thank you. Act 1. The Black Barn. Chapter 1. The Speed of Pain. Norton Sinclair, wearing a surgical mask, navigated through a desolate area filled with debris and broken objects. He rummaged through the wreckage, picking up a bent nail. Muttering to himself, he called out, "Come on, I know you're here." As he moved through the rubble, his desperation became clear. His search led to a peculiar discovery, a piece of wood. He cautiously collected the sharp fragment and stored it in a container, his expression revealing a mix of intrigue and apprehension. He returned to a small, confined living space filled with shelves and jars, each labelled with dates and cryptic details. Pulling out containers, he appeared to search for something significant. His meticulous actions suggested an obsessive need to document or preserve. In a moment heavy with unease, he recited the Lord's Prayer. The broken wood and shadows around him added to the foreboding atmosphere. A larger, sinister force seemed to loom. The prayer ended with a somber Amen, deepening the sense of dread. Father Wilfred Quinn drove through an expansive countryside, approaching a small town in Gideon Falls. The fields stretched endlessly, punctuated by an old barn and a windmill. Inside the car, a crucifix hanging from the rearview mirror hinted at his role as a priest. A bottle in hand, he reminisced about the conversation with a bishop. The bishop had arranged Wilfred's transfer to Gideon Falls following the death of Father Tom, the previous pastor who had served for over 30 years. Wilfred was reluctant, expressing that quiet was not what he needed, but the bishop insisted the town required his leadership. Despite Wilfred's self-doubt and preference for remaining at the seminary, the bishop affirmed that his path now led to Gideon Falls, urging him to find purpose there. Upon arriving in town, Wilfred encountered a man smoking by a school bus. The man's demeanor was casual yet unsettling, and Wilfred sighed, muttering, "Christ Almighty," before continuing to the church. There, he was met by Jean Tremblay, a cheerful and welcoming parishioner who identified herself as the head of the Catholic Women's League. She joked about his clerical attire giving him away and explained she had cleaned and prepared the rectory for his arrival. Jean gave Wilfred a tour of the rectory, showing him the well-stocked kitchen and offering assistance, though Wilfred politely declined her offers for lunch and tea. As they concluded, Wilfred asked Jean about Father Tom's death, admitting that in the rush to arrive, no one had told him how it happened. Jean's demeanor turned serious, signalling that the answer might not be straightforward. She seemed surprised he wasn't already informed and deflected the question, implying it wasn't due to natural causes. Struggling to articulate her feelings, she confessed that Father Tom had been like a father to her and preferred not to discuss it further. Wilfred apologized for upsetting her, and they parted with Jean assuring him she would see him at Mass. Elsewhere, Norton sat across from Dr. Angela Shue during a therapy session. He described a growing sense of literal evil encroaching on the city, something tangible and sinister. He reflected on how he once thought of it as an abstract force, but now believed it to be a real entity. Dr. Shue challenged his perspective, linking his fears to his compulsive trash scavenging. She reminded him that this obsession was a symptom of his mental illness. Norton insisted it was different this time, claiming the trash was revealing truths to him. Norton thought about his apartment where the walls were covered in photographs and notes cataloguing items he had collected. He explained his growing conviction that the collected pieces formed a connection to something greater and darker. As his discoveries grew, so did his unease, feeling that they brought him closer to evil itself. He said that all the pieces that he collected came from the same place. Dr. Shu remained skeptical. She reminded Norton of the progress he had made since leaving the hospital and expressed concern that his behavior was regressing. She warned him that if he didn't address his fixation, he might lose his independence. Norton reluctantly agreed to continue with his coping strategies, but as he left the session, his determination to pursue his findings seemed unshaken. Walking through the rainy city, Norton repeated affirmations to himself, struggling to balance his reality. He walked by a nail, but then he felt something evil in it. He came back and collected it. At Gideon Falls, Wilfred lay in bed when a voice woke him, whispering urgently to wake up. Startled, he turned to find the ghostly figure of Father Tom, bathed in red light, warning him that he'll notice I'm missing. Confused and alarmed, Wilfred sat up, asking, "Father Tom, is that you?" The apparition of Tom seemed desperate, urging him to act quickly. As the figure vanished, Wilfred chased after it, pleading for him to stop. He shouted that everyone thought Father Tom was dead and begged him to explain. Tom cryptically replied, "No time," and continued disappearing into the distance. Wilfred hesitated momentarily, standing shirtless in the rain and calling out, "Tom?" The narrative shifted to Norton, reflecting in his journal. He wrote about a recent session with Dr. Shu, expressing concern about her potentially interfering with his work. Norton wrestled with conflicting feelings, knowing Dr. Shu meant well, but fearing she didn't understand the importance of what he was uncovering. He admitted he was reluctant to reveal the full scope of his findings, unsure of how she might react. Norton recounted how a recent vision revealed the true shape of the objects he'd been collecting. He described his discovery as horrifying yet revelatory, stating that he finally understood their significance. Norton believed the pieces were leading him to a mysterious, ominous place, the Black Barn. Meanwhile, Wilfred also stood in awe as the Black Barn appeared in the cornfield for an instant. Wilfred stumbled through a field, clutching a strange red shard that seemed unnatural and unsettling. He prayed aloud, questioning his faith and why he was burdened with this knowledge. He described the vision of the Black Barn as terrifying, initially wanting to flee but ultimately feeling compelled to understand it. In the final moments, Wilfred discovered the lifeless body of Jean Tremblay, her chest pierced by an unnatural object. Overcome with shock, he knelt beside her. He declared he had seen evil and now believed he wouldn't have to face it alone, hinting at a looming confrontation with the sinister force tied to the Black Barn. Chapter 2. All the little sinners say hallelujah. In the park, Dr. Shu praised Norton's progress, which he acknowledged hesitantly. As they walked, he became fixated on a specific bench, sensing the presence of trash underneath. Despite his urge to look, he refrained, instead confessing his desire to Dr. Shu. She encouraged him for sharing rather than acting impulsively, emphasizing the importance of focusing on reality rather than his obsessive tendencies. Norton admitted feeling that the trash held something significant, though he couldn't explain what. As they continued their walk, Norton revealed his belief that the garbage contained a piece he was searching for. Dr. Shu pressed him to explain, but Norton became visibly distressed, refusing to elaborate. He cryptically warned that understanding his discoveries might put her in danger. Dr. Shu, however, reassured him of her resilience and offered a deal. She would allow him to investigate the trash if he explained his obsession. Reluctantly, Norton returned to the bench and sifted through the garbage but found nothing substantial. Disappointed, he sat back down. Dr. Shu seized the opportunity to demand answers, asking what he believed he was finding. Norton revealed that his obsession stemmed from recurring dreams he'd had since childhood, which had grown more frequent. These dreams, he explained, involved a fragmented vision of something he was piecing together over time. Finally, Norton unfolded a sketch he had drawn, a crude but striking image of a barn, which he identified as the Black Barn. He seemed haunted by its significance, but couldn't fully articulate why it dominated his thoughts. At Gideon Falls, Father Wilfred sat distressed and handcuffed opposite Sheriff Clara Miller in the interrogation room. He explained his encounter with Father Tom, the deceased priest he had been sent to replace, claiming Tom appeared in his room and led him into the field. The sheriff countered, pointing out that Father Tom had been dead for 2 weeks. She described how Tom's car and belongings were recovered by the creek, though his body was never found. Wilfred, desperate, insisted Tom was alive and pleaded for them to search instead of interrogating him. The sheriff, unconvinced, questioned his sobriety and revealed his troubled history: removal from parishes due to incidents involving alcohol, public intoxication, and assault. Wilfrid admitted past mistakes but denied their relevance. When he described the surreal events, finding himself alone with Mrs. Tremblay's body, the sheriff dismissed his claims as fabrications, accusing him of hiding guilt. Wilfrid's frustration mounted as his pleas for understanding went ignored. Overwhelmed, Wilfrid struggled to defend himself, but Miller made her disbelief clear, stating she didn't trust his account. Deputy Reggie hesitated, suggesting they ease up, but Clara dismissed his concern, asserting her skepticism. Their tension was interrupted by Tony, another deputy, who barged in with urgent news. A second body had been discovered. Elsewhere, Norton entered his building, moving cautiously as he encountered a man stepping out of an elevator. The man, bald and wearing a red cap, greeted him briefly, leaving Norton unsettled. Norton's unease grew as he walked down a long hallway and entered his room. He was baffled to find that his entire room was ransacked. Most of the trash that he had collected had been taken, including one of his scalpels. Meanwhile, Wilfrid called a bishop for help, explaining his predicament. He begged for support, declaring his innocence and revealing his fear and confusion about the murders. The bishop, calm and detached, questioned whether Wilfrid committed the crimes. Wilfrid vehemently denied it, insisting Father Tom's involvement complicated the situation. The bishop cryptically suggested that Wilfrid's assignment in Gideon Falls was part of a divine plan. Wilfrid, desperate to leave, was told instead that his role was vital to the town's future. The bishop's dismissal left Wilfrid frustrated with the weight of the town's mysteries bearing down on him. As Deputy Tony Ballard escorted Wilfrid back to his cell, their conversation turned more candid. Ballard expressed some belief in Wilfrid's story, hinting at his own unease about the town's strange events. He suggested Wilfrid seek help from a mysterious figure named Doc Sutton, describing him as an unusual but potentially helpful person. However, Ballard withheld further details, fearing Sheriff Clara Miller's reprimand if their discussion was discovered. Wilfrid, now more intrigued than ever, pressed for more information, but Ballard refused, leaving him to ponder Sutton's potential involvement in unraveling the mystery. Meanwhile, Norton, visibly agitated, barged into Dr. Shu's office, insisting on speaking with her immediately. Despite Shu being occupied with another patient, he demanded her attention, citing a break-in at his apartment. He claimed that someone had stolen critical samples related to his research on the Black Barn. Dr. Shu, trying to calm him, labelled his concerns as paranoia, though Norton passionately refuted her dismissal. Their argument escalated as Norton accused her of betraying him by not taking his claims seriously. Ultimately, Dr. Shu, deeply concerned for Norton's worsening mental state, proposed he return to the hospital for treatment. Norton, feeling betrayed, accused her of plotting to imprison him and stormed out, declaring his trust in her shattered. Sheriff Miller and her deputy drove to a grim discovery deep in the woods. At the crime scene, Father Tom's body was discovered, appearing freshly dead despite having drowned weeks ago. Sheriff Miller and Deputy Reggie were puzzled by this contradiction. Reggie pointed out something clenched in the corpse's hand, a nail, suggesting a deeper, mysterious connection to recent events. Miller began to question if Father Wilfrid's claims might have some truth after all. Later, Dr. Shu, walking through the city, reflected on her professional and personal concerns for Norton. She admitted to a colleague over the phone that while Norton had shown progress, his recent behaviour had become alarming. Her growing worry was that he might harm himself or others. As she considered reporting Norton's state, a shadowy figure seemed to watch her, creating an ominous atmosphere. Suddenly, her phone call was interrupted as her surroundings changed drastically. She found herself facing the eerie, blood-red image of the Black Barn, which loomed before her in a surreal and terrifying vision. The sight shook her, and the ominous tension grew as shadowy figures emerged, heightening the sense of dread. As she reeled from the vision, Dr. Shu collapsed to the ground in shock. Strangers passed by indifferently, oblivious to her distress. In desperation, she muttered, "Oh God," as the unsettling experience consumed her. Chapter 3: The Faller of Trees. Wilfrid struggled to focus on his sermon preparations, erasing and rewriting in frustration. Unable to concentrate, he eyed a whiskey bottle nearby. He poured a drink, but was interrupted by Sheriff Miller knocking at his door. She entered, joking about whether she would arrest him again. Declining coffee, she inquired about his writing, prompting him to admit his difficulty concentrating due to recent events. Miller revealed new lab results. Blood on Father Tom matched Jean Tremblay's, confirming Father Tom as the killer. Despite the evidence, Wilfred expressed doubt, stating it didn't align with the man he knew. Miller agreed the situation felt wrong, but emphasized the facts. Miller apologized for suspecting Wilfred earlier, assuring him he was cleared of any involvement. However, she highlighted the town's trust in the church and Wilfred's past, implying he needed to rebuild credibility. Wilfred acknowledged his past struggles and asserted his determination to prove himself trustworthy. Meanwhile, Norton recorded his thoughts in a journal, explaining how his lab had been compromised. Intruders stole tools, including his scalpel and nails linked to his research on the Black Barn. Frustrated but resolute, Norton fortified his lab, setting traps and securing his workspace. Despite his anxiety, he remained determined to protect his discoveries. Ready for another intrusion, he resolved to confront whoever came next. Norton anxiously reacted to a series of knocks at his door. Gripping a hammer for protection, he hesitantly asked who was outside. Dr. Shu responded, identifying herself, which visibly startled Norton. He reluctantly opened the door, but warned her not to touch the doorknob or anything else, emphasizing his extreme caution. She complied, confused by his behavior, and stepped inside. Norton apologized for his abruptness and awkwardly welcomed her into his space. Dr. Shu looked around, remarking on the condition of Norton's makeshift lab. She shared her shock and confusion about an unexplainable event she had witnessed, struggling to make sense of it. She admitted to spending hours rationalizing it before coming to Norton. Her voice trembled as she confessed that what had happened to her seemed impossible, yet undeniably real. Norton, with a mix of fear and understanding, listened intently and responded solemnly, "I saw the Black Barn." Father Wilfred stood up for his sermon. His hesitance was evident as he coughed to compose himself before addressing the congregation. He acknowledged the tragic events that had shaken the community and expressed his own doubts and struggles in understanding the reasons behind such occurrences. His words sought to unite the townsfolk, emphasizing the importance of trust and support amidst the chaos. After the service, townsfolk interacted with Father Wilfred, expressing gratitude for his honesty. He met new faces, including Joe Reddy, the school bus driver, and his wife Janet. They inquired about Wilfred's past, to which he described himself as a wandering vagabond before joining the seminary. Through these conversations, Wilfred began to integrate into the community while grappling with the heavy responsibility of guiding them through their fears and uncertainties. Norton continued his conversation with Dr. Shu, trying to grasp the reality of her vision of the Black Barn. She confessed it was not a dream, but something she witnessed vividly. She described a dark figure standing in the open doorway of the barn, defined only by its ominous smile. The memory visibly unsettled her as she struggled to reconcile what she had experienced with her rational mind. Norton insisted it proved his claims about the barn, reiterating that it was real and had chosen her as well. As Dr. Shu attempted to calm Norton down, he grew more animated, rejecting the idea that it could be a shared psychosis. He believed the barn's influence was deliberate and profound, something tangible and beyond mere imagination. Dr. Shu, overwhelmed, tried to ground the conversation in reason, but Norton's conviction only grew stronger. He insisted that their shared experiences were a puzzle to be solved together. When Dr. Shu finally decided to leave, Norton warned her about his makeshift security measures, preventing her from triggering a booby trap. She expressed her frustration, suggesting he pack a bag and return to the hospital. Norton, however, refused to comply, confidently stating she wouldn't report him because she now knew the truth. Meanwhile, Father Wilfred examined documents and photographs related to the mysterious barn. These included newspaper clippings and historical records that hinted at a recurring phenomenon tied to strange disappearances and sightings of the Black Barn. Among the documents was a note addressed to Father Tom, suggesting he had been safeguarding critical information. The weight of these findings deepened Wilfred's sense of unease as he pieced together the clues, and then he remembered that the deputy had asked him to meet Doc Sutton. Later, Father Wilfred approached a remote property marked by a mailbox labelled Sutton. He hesitated briefly before knocking on the door. An eccentric, bearded man answered, amused by Wilfred's clerical attire, and invited him in, revealing he had been expecting him. The man, identifying himself as Doc Sutton, explained that divine intervention had compelled him to send for someone, specifically a priest, due to the dire situation involving Gideon Falls. Introducing himself, himself. Father Wilfred insisted on being called Fred. Inside, the room was a chaotic yet methodical display of clippings, maps, and sketches centered on the mysterious Black Barn. Sutton spoke passionately about his research, emphasizing the supernatural forces at play. He pointed out the significance of the barn's appearances throughout history and its connections to disappearances and deaths in the town. Declaring the situation a war against an ominous force, Sutton enlisted Wilfred, calling him a soldier in the battle for Gideon Falls' survival. Chapter 4 – Twin Shadows. Dr. Sutton explained the historical connection of Gideon Falls to the enigmatic Black Barn, presenting newspaper clippings and photos pinned across his walls. He pointed out the barn's recurring presence, dating back to 1794, when early settlers documented its sudden appearance and the devastating events that followed, including fires and mysterious deaths. He described the barn as more than just a haunting structure, attributing to it a dark and powerful influence. Sutton referenced a series of events, including a 1969 arrest of a man who killed 7 teenagers and filled his cabin walls with drawings of the Black Barn. Sutton admitted he didn't fully understand what the Black Barn was, but described it as a source of evil that must be stopped. Father Fred, skeptical of Sutton's theories, expressed doubt about the barn's reality, dismissing the accounts as mythology. Sutton countered, urging Fred to believe in the significance of the barn and its impact on the town's dark history. Sutton then revealed a photograph of a group called the Ploughmen, a collective that had studied and fought against the Black Barn's influence for over a century. He identified Fred as one of their members, much to Fred's surprise, linking him to the group through his predecessor, Father Tom, who had believed in the barn's reality. Meanwhile, Fred found a scalpel lying on Sutton's table. Sutton's urgency grew as he emphasized the need for Fred's faith to confront the barn's power. Fred, unconvinced, rejected Sutton's pleas, claiming his belief lay in God, not supernatural myths. Sutton, frustrated, demanded Fred reconsider, referencing an incident that Fred had witnessed. Fred acknowledged seeing something, but refused to validate it as proof of the barn's existence. Sutton admitted he himself had never seen the barn, which Fred pointed out, questioning Sutton's certainty. The conversation ended with Fred walking away, leaving Sutton alone with his research, pondering the nature of faith and truth. Elsewhere, Norton's case file revealed a troubled history with a childhood marked by amnesia and institutionalization. Dr. Shu reviewed these details, emotionally burdened. She paused to gather herself, reflecting on the gravity of Norton's experiences, and stood in front of a mirror. She washed her face and noticed her towel soiled with black spots. When she raised the towel, her reflection in the mirror behind her was replaced by the Black Barn in the backdrop of a blood-red sky. This haunting vision startled her, and she looked around in confusion. She retreated to the bathroom door, peering out cautiously. Her reflection showed a man in a workshop sitting with a hammer, seemingly unaware of her presence. As she observed him, her alarm grew. Her realization that this vision might be connected to the sinister events surrounding the barn overwhelmed her, and she cried out in fear as the reality around her distorted into a surreal fragmentation of chaotic mosaic of cubes. Father Fred arrived at Sheriff Miller's house during the evening rain, carrying an envelope. Sheriff Miller, initially surprised but polite, offered him a seat. Fred presented the envelope, explaining it had been found hidden beneath a floorboard in Father Tom's room. Sheriff Miller inspected its contents and appeared unfazed, expressing her skepticism about the barn's mythos. She mentioned visiting Dr. Sutton, who had connected the barn to a group called the Ploughmen, which she dismissed as a conspiracy. Fred asked if she knew of a deputy, Ballard, allegedly linked to the group. Sheriff Miller admitted she did not, but promised to investigate. She accused Sutton and others of using the barn legend as a scapegoat for real-world problems, arguing that myths often shield people from harsh truths. The exchange became tense when Sheriff Miller implied that Fred's religious beliefs also leaned on such tales, leaving him momentarily unsettled. She ended with a sharp remark about her distrust of his team, which Fred deflected with mild humor. Sheriff Miller, remorseful for her earlier sharp remark, apologized to Father Fred, who reassured her that no offense was taken. As the rain fell steadily, Fred asked if she had any family, hesitating before awkwardly clarifying about her husband. Miller admitted she was alone, explaining that she had been married, but her husband had passed away. Fred offered his condolences, and Miller added that they had married young, though it had been a long time ago. Their conversation was interrupted by Miller's phone ringing. She answered and spoke with Tony, who delivered delivered urgent news that required her attention. Her tone grew tense as she instructed Tony to stay put and call for backup while she made her way to the location. Fred, concerned, asked if everything was all right. Miller, preparing to leave, mentioned a situation that needed her immediate response. She initially declined Fred's offer to assist, telling him to go home, but then reconsidered and asked him to drive instead, admitting she had been drinking. Norton walked through the rain, navigating a crumbling urban area scattered with debris. Wearing a mask, he appeared focused on his surroundings. He sensed someone following him and ambushed that person. The person was Dr. Shu, and she was startled to the core. Norton apologized and said that he hadn't heard her approach due to the rain. He said sorry for not responding sooner. Dr. Shu, visibly shaken, explained that she had been following him and needed to talk, mentioning that something else had happened. She revealed she had seen the black barn again, or at least part of it, and shared her growing fear. Norton tried to reassure her, though her terror left him uneasy. As they spoke, Shu expressed her fear that something terrible was imminent. The dark presence of the black barn weighed heavily as they clung to each other, seeking comfort in the shared unease. Father Fred drove through the dark countryside with Sheriff Miller. Fred expressed concern about the situation, but Miller reassured him that Deputy Ballard had reported trouble at Joe Reddy's farm. Fred recognized Reddy from a recent church service. As they approached the house, Miller told Fred to stay in the car while she investigated. Arriving at the farm, Miller encountered Joe's wife, Janet, who appeared traumatized. Janet explained that Joe Reddy had made her call the sheriff and then forced her to wait outside. Miller, alarmed, tried to contact Ballard and Tony, but received no response. She ordered Janet to stay put while she entered the house cautiously with her gun drawn. Inside, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense as Miller moved through the dimly lit interior. Father Fred, against her earlier instructions, followed her inside. Miller warned him to stay back as she opened a door, only to find a horrifying scene. Joe Reddy sat on the floor, covered in blood, holding a bloody hammer. He was the man who Dr. Shu saw in the mirror. Above Joe, the mutilated body of a policeman hung upside down in a gruesome display. Joe greeted Fred ominously, saying, "Hello, Father. I've been waiting for you." Chapter 5. We are all just soft instruments. Sheriff Miller and Father Fred faced escalating tension and horror. Joe greeted Father Fred menacingly, clutching a bloodied hammer, stating he had been waiting for him. Miller drew her weapon and ordered Joe to drop the hammer, but he refused, attacking Miller and knocking the gun from her hands. A gunshot echoed as the weapon hit the ground, intensifying the chaos. Joe stabbed Father Fred with a scalpel, muttering cryptic remarks about Fred's time coming soon. But not yet. Despite the injury, Fred insisted he would be okay and urged Miller to continue, prioritizing the situation over his wound. Meanwhile, Janet stumbled outside. Her throat had been sliced open and she was bleeding profusely. Miller rushed to her aid. Janet collapsed in Miller's arms, weakly telling her that she had seen Miller inside, though Miller had no idea what Janet was talking about. Janet's condition worsened rapidly, and despite Miller's pleas for help, Janet succumbed to her injuries, leaving Miller devastated. Determined to uncover the truth, Miller pressed forward, refusing Fred's suggestion to wait for backup. She moved cautiously through the field, gun drawn, while Fred struggled to keep up. As the tension grew, an ominous shape became visible in the distance, a section of the field unnaturally flattened, where they found a scalpel. Miller resolved that they needed to speak with Dr. Sutton, holding the scalpel up. At Norton's place, Dr. Shu and Norton discussed the barn. Dr. Shu asked about the time Norton first saw the barn. Norton said that he saw it when he was 4 or 5 years old. He thought that they were just dreams, but then his experiences started getting recurring and more real. Dr. Shu inquired about Norton's childhood, and he shared fragmented memories of the city, the police, the orphanage, and a hospital where he endured immense suffering. Norton admitted he had tried to end his life multiple times, but was saved by a revelation involving garbage. Dr. Shu acknowledged this, revealing that Norton's obsession with garbage had dominated their therapy sessions, preventing deeper exploration of his pain. Norton explained that garbage became a symbol of salvation for him, guiding him toward a higher purpose. The conversation shifted to the black barn, which Norton viewed as the only way to fix himself, despite its horrifying and evil nature. Dr. Shu expressed fear, torn between wanting to help him and dreading the barn's influence. She acknowledged a similar contradiction in her feelings, fear, and attraction to the barn's pull. She asked Norton if he had ever been hypnotized. Sheriff Miller and Father Fred visited Dr. Sutton's home to discuss the ongoing events. Miller informed Sutton that his fields and surrounding areas were being searched for clues, with no sign of Joe Reddy. Fred insisted on speaking with Sutton despite Miller's suggestion to leave. Sutton greeted them and was surprised to see Fred, asking about the unexpected visit. Noticing Fred's injured hand, he offered to stitch it up. Inside, Sutton examined the scalpel Fred had found and confirmed it wasn't his, though he recognized it as important. He inquired where Fred had found it. Fred explained they had chased Reddy into a cornfield where he disappeared, leaving behind flattened corn and the scalpel. Sutton, visibly disturbed, compared the flattened corn to an event from years ago, linking it to the disappearance of Miller's brother. The crop had been flattened that day too, as if a large structure had pressed down upon it. Miller grew defensive, claiming the barn wasn't responsible for her brother's disappearance. Sutton accused her of being in denial. Miller lashed out at Sutton, calling his obsession with the barn a fantasy and expressing embarrassment over his behavior. She accused him of retreating into conspiracy theories instead of searching for her brother in the real world. Sutton retorted that Miller had kept her embarrassment a secret, and their argument escalated. It was revealed that Sutton was actually Miller's father. Fred tried to refocus the conversation, asking for clarity about the barn. Sutton remained adamant that the barn was connected to everything, referencing the Black Barn's malevolent influence. The tension between Sutton and Miller highlighted their strained relationship, revealing unresolved guilt and blame surrounding Miller's brother's disappearance. Sutton passionately defended his obsession, claiming it had opened his eyes to the truth, while accusing Miller of denying reality. Miller, skeptical, questioned whether Joe Reddy could have been responsible for her brother's disappearance. Sutton vehemently denied it, asserting that Reddy had once been a good man corrupted by the barn's influence. Sutton handed Miller a child's crude drawing of the barn, revealing that he had found it in her brother's room after his disappearance. Miller accused him of lying, prompting Sutton to recount the night before her brother vanished. The boy had visited Sutton late at night, terrified of a nightmare involving the barn. Sutton admitted he had dismissed the boy and sent him back to bed, only to deeply regret it, as it was the last time he had seen his son. His voice cracked as he declared he would never lie about such a painful memory. Miller asked why Sutton had never shared this before. Sutton explained that she had been too young at the time and later rejected him and his beliefs. Frustrated, Miller lashed out, dismissing Sutton's theories as absurd. She accused him of clinging to a fantasy instead of facing reality. Fred attempted to mediate, suggesting they hear Sutton out, but Miller stormed off, disgusted with both men. Meanwhile, Norton underwent a hypnotic regression under Dr. Shu's guidance. He described a surreal descent into a landscape of garbage, identifying it as the landfill where he believed his journey had begun. Norton hesitated to look back, fearing the bad things behind him, but Shu encouraged him to retrace his steps. Reluctantly, Norton identified a specific location, Carlton and Jarvis, a vacant lot. Norton started walking through the shadows of the vacant lot. The deeper he ventured, the darker it became, until he saw something hidden in the shadows. Norton exclaimed in awe and fear as he spotted a vivid red door. He identified it as the door and believed it led to the Black Barn. Meanwhile, in Dr. Sutton's office, Sutton insisted that if the barn had Reddy, it was only a matter of time before he killed again. Sutton passionately argued that the barn's influence was undeniable and urged Fred to join him in fighting it. However, Fred remained skeptical and insisted that the sheriff and her team should handle the matter. Their discussion was interrupted by a sudden, ominous gunshot from outside. Fred and Sutton rushed outside to investigate. Fred called out for Sheriff Miller but received no response. The eerie atmosphere grew more intense as Fred wandered further, his unease escalating. Sutton warned Fred to be cautious, emphasizing the danger of what they might encounter. Fred eventually saw the door to the Black Barn in the distance. Its overwhelming red glow seemed alive, radiating a foreboding presence. Fred called after Miller, desperately chasing her. To his horror, he saw Miller unconscious, being carried into the glowing door by Joe Reddy. Without hesitation, Fred ran through the door behind them and vanished inside the red light. Norton's voice echoed ominously. Once the door had been opened, it could not be closed again. Chapter 6. Right here, waiting. Norton and Dr. Shu arrived at the intersection of Jarvis and Carlton, the location Norton remembered as significant. Dr. Shu questioned whether Norton was certain this was the right place. Norton confidently affirmed, recalling the street names and insisting, "This is the place." Shu reflected on how the area had changed, noting it was once an industrial wasteland, but was now filled with condos and cafes, making it difficult to recognize. Norton, however, remained adamant, stating he could feel the connection. Determined, Norton rushed ahead, despite Shu urging caution. He led her to a vacant lot, pointing out how peculiar it was that, despite the surrounding development, this specific lot remained empty. Norton frantically searched through the overgrown vegetation, repeating, "It has to be here." Shu suggested leaving as it was getting late, but Norton continued. Finally, he uncovered something among the debris. "Here it is," he exclaimed triumphantly. Norton revealed an outline of wooden planks forming the shape of a door frame, though the doorway itself appeared empty. Shu observed the setup in disbelief. Norton declared that it wasn't just a door, it was the doorway. His tone shifted to resolute determination as he stated he now understood what they must do. Meanwhile, Sutton searched the woods, calling for Father Fred. Growing desperate, he spotted the glowing red door in the distance. Despite Sutton's warnings not to enter, Fred walked toward it, disappearing through its ominous glow. Inside, Fred experienced disorienting sensations as his perception fragmented into surreal imagery. It felt as if his body was broken into atoms and remade inside the barn. He called out for Sheriff Miller, his voice echoing as the environment distorted further. As he moved forward, he noticed random objects floating around: nails, cogwheels, bottles, a severed head, and a skull. It seemed the barn had collected these things arbitrarily. Fred soon came across a massive machine emitting lightning from its antennae. Miller stood in front of it, her throat slashed and bleeding. She turned to Fred and ominously said, "I see you. You have secrets in your belly." Dimensions around Fred collapsed into a singularity before rebuilding themselves. He suddenly found himself in his own room with his partner, Rebecca. She urged him to come to bed, but Fred refused. Rebecca ridiculed him for not listening to her, even after she had sacrificed everything. Fred admitted he couldn't continue. Rebecca covered her mouth, but blood began to flow out of it. Her face changed into that of Miller's. Fred saw Miller collapsing in front of him, warning him that someone was behind him. Turning around, Fred saw Joe standing there with Miller's gun. The scene around Fred shifted into a time loop. The bullet from Miller's wound came out in reverse and entered the gun in Joe's hand. Then time moved forward, and Joe gunned her down. This kept repeating until Fred lunged towards Joe and punched him, only for their bodies to merge. He plunged through an abyss of crucifixions and cosmic imagery. Suspended upside down among rows of crucifixes, he struggled, finally landing in front of a figure resembling Christ. The figure greeted him, addressing him as Wilfred, and revealed that he was in the Black Barn. Fred, visibly shaken, demanded to know what was happening. The figure cryptically offered Fred a choice, presenting him with two pedestals. One bore a teddy bear, representing the choice to save Miller, while the other held a screen showing a diagram of the barn, promising answers to everything. Fred hesitated, confused by the stakes. When he asked why he was being left alone to make such a monumental decision, the figure accused him of losing his faith, asserting that without belief, no help could be given. Fred reluctantly reached for the teddy bear. Suddenly, Joe's head appeared, looming down upon him, and said, "Wrong choice." Joe materialized and attacked Fred as the surroundings came back to normal. Fred lay on the ground and told Joe that he was insane. Joe said that there was no such thing as insanity. Fred jumped and snatched the gun from Joe's belt. As Joe charged at him, Fred shot him down. As Fred picked Miller up and walked out, she muttered about Daniel, her brother, being there. She said that she had seen him. Sutton attended to her and asked Fred to get the medical supplies, reassuring Miller that he was there. Miller's survival was considered a miracle, crediting her father's presence. Inside the hospital, Miller lay recovering, hooked to an IV. Father Fred checked on her, acknowledging Sutton's resourcefulness. Miller confirmed that she and her father had reconnected, at least temporarily. Fred inquired about her memory of the events. Miller recounted her encounter with Reddy. She confronted him outside her father's house, fired a shot that drove him into the woods, and lost track of him. Later, Reddy ambushed her, gaining control of the gun and shooting her. Beyond that, her memory became a blur, punctuated by hearing Fred calling her name and another gunshot. Fred probed further, and Miller hesitantly revealed that she saw her brother Daniel during the ordeal, though she knew it sounded implausible. Fred reassured her that nothing sounded crazy anymore. But when he mentioned the black barn, Miller grew defensive, accusing him of betraying her trust. She shifted the conversation, stating her belief that Daniel was still alive and her intent to find him. As Fred processed her determination, he exited the hospital and received a call from his bishop. Their cryptic exchange implied that Fred's placement in Gideon Falls was deliberate, tied to the mysteries of the barn. Meanwhile, Norton and Dr. Shu stood in the empty lot. Norton, driven by conviction, declared that all the fragments of the barn must be gathered at this spot. Despite Shu's apprehension, Norton insisted on their mission to rebuild the Black Barn, regardless of the consequences. Act 2, Original Sins, Chapter 1, The Sum of Its Parts. Reality seemed upside down as a menacing voice beckoned a boy to become my doorway. Terrified, the boy screamed, "No!" and ran away. He stumbled through urban streets, the environment cold and alienating. A concerned woman approached him, asking if he was lost and where his parents were. The boy, uncertain and scared, admitted he didn't know and said he was lost. The woman, showing concern, tried to help and inquired about his home. The boy replied that he lived in Gideon Falls but struggled to provide specifics, instead claiming he resided on a farm. She pressed further, asking for his name. With uncertainty, he answered, "I think my name is Norton Sinclair." The exchange carried a chilling undertone as his identity seemed tenuous, almost fractured. Meanwhile, Norton stood with Dr. Shu at the vacant lot, the site of his obsessive discoveries about the Black Barn. Norton admitted he believed the fragments of the barn he had been collecting needed to come together to rebuild it. Shu questioned the feasibility of his plan, expressing skepticism and labeling the idea crazy. Norton countered her hesitation, accusing her of thinking it, even if she didn't say it aloud. Norton's desperation grew as he pleaded for her help, stating he couldn't do it alone anymore. Shu, sensing his distress, offered reluctant support, but expressed unease about the sinister atmosphere surrounding the place. Despite her concerns, she agreed to assist him, and they prepared to move forward with his plan. Later, Father Fred visited Miller, who was recuperating at home. Their conversation was casual but layered with tension. Fred commented on her release from the hospital, while Miller joked about wallowing. Fred hesitantly asked if Miller remembered much about what happened on the night with Joe Reddy. Miller admitted that her memories were hazy, recalling only fragments. She remembered Reddy attacking her, dragging her out of his house, and the events becoming blurrier with time. Fred echoed her sentiment, likening his own memories to a bad dream that was slowly fading. Fred then shifted the conversation to Miller's search for her brother, Daniel, and asked if she had any leads. Miller revealed she hadn't found anything new, but believed everything was connected. She held on to hope and refused to give up, despite the lack of progress. Fred reassured her, offering his support if she needed it. As Fred stood to leave, Miller teased him about his habit of moving between parishes frequently, warning him not to get too attached to Gideon Falls. Fred acknowledged her remark with humour, saying he might stick around longer this time. As they parted ways, Miller noted that Gideon Falls had a way of holding on to people. Miller went inside her house, where she inspected a teddy bear connected to her brother, Daniel. A flashback revealed her protecting Daniel on a school bus when other kids teased him for holding the bear. Miller lashed out at the bullies, defending Daniel. Her actions got her scolded by the bus driver, who demanded an explanation. Miller tried to justify herself by pointing out the bullying, but the driver dismissed her actions as unacceptable. She apologized to the bus driver, who was Joe Reddy. Joe responded with a chilling kindness, suggesting Miller and her brother Daniel move closer to him. This memory triggered Miller's realization of something sinister, and she muttered an expletive in disbelief. Miller called her father, struggling to articulate her thoughts. She claimed to have a revelation about Daniel's disappearance, mentioning Joe Reddy, their former bus driver, took him. Her father reacted with confusion and disbelief, prompting Miller to insist on the connection, despite its unsettling implications. Meanwhile, Norton and Dr. Shu were in his workspace, surrounded by the fragments of the Black Barn. Norton explained his difficulty piecing together the fragments, likening it to solving a puzzle without an image to guide him. Overwhelmed by the complexity, he expressed doubt. Dr. Shu, sensing his distress, reassured him, offering her support and reminding him he was not alone in this pursuit. But right then, someone knocked at the door. Norton panicked, urging Shu not to open it, fearing the worst. Shu dismissed his fears, suggesting it was likely nothing, and proceeded to investigate. As she went near the door, someone kicked it open, and an unidentified man forced his way inside, causing Shu to scream. The intruder turned out to be Dr. Kadri, Shu's colleague, accompanied by another individual. Kadri claimed they had been searching for Shu, citing her recent troubles with a patient. He attempted to reassure her, stating they would handle everything and that she was safe now. Norton's panic escalated as Dr. Shu tried to reason with Dr. Kadri, telling him his actions were inappropriate. She insisted that Norton was her patient and that the situation was under control. However, Kadri ignored her protests, assuring her they had everything handled. Norton, overwhelmed, repeatedly screamed "No!" as his fear consumed him. It turned violent as Kadri's men restrained Norton. He fought back, yelling for Dr. Shu to help and to let him go, but Kadri ordered them to hold Norton down. With a chilling tone, Kadri admonished Norton, calling him a bad boy and ominously stating that it was time for Norton to come home. Kadri's words became even more unsettling as he promised that they would soon be together again and Norton would fulfill what he was born to be. As Norton was being taken away, he witnessed the flash of the laughing man on Kadri's face. Chapter 2. Killer Smile. In the dining hall of St. Mark's, Sister Josephine urged the children to eat quickly and be on time for their lessons. Norton, seated among the students, was visibly uneasy. A sinister voice interrupted Sister Josephine's commands, speaking directly to Norton, telling him not to listen to the old bitch and claiming others wanted to suffocate him and keep him away. The voice promised that nothing could separate them. As Norton stared into his bowl, a cockroach surfaced, causing him to gasp and spill his food. Sister Josephine rushed over, scolding him for creating a mess. Norton tried to explain what he saw, but his words fell on deaf ears. She reprimanded him, calling him a naughty boy and twisting his ear harshly. She declared that such behavior was unacceptable at St. Mark's and instructed him to leave the hall. As Norton walked away, the ominous voice returned, encouraging him to come to the dark. Norton was led down to a dimly lit basement, Sister Josephine's tone stern as she spoke about punishment and reflection. Norton pleaded, insisting it was an accident, but Sister Josephine dismissed his cries, calling them irrelevant in God's house, where there were only children or sinners. She locked him in the basement, leaving him alone in the oppressive darkness, telling him he would learn where he belonged. As Norton sat on the floor, despairing, the malevolent voice resurfaced, taunting him about his isolation and saying this was where he truly belonged, in the dirt and trash. Norton begged for the voice to leave him alone, but it persisted, stating he would never escape until he found the source. Slowly, the laughing man with glowing red eyes and teeth emerged, repeating the chilling promise that there was nowhere to hide, no place or time to escape. Overcome by terror, Norton's surroundings morphed into a sterile cell. It was now a memory from the time he was in the asylum. He screamed for release, banging on the walls. A guard ignored his pleas, stating Norton needed his medicine. Despite Norton's desperate protests, the guard injected him, coldly declaring, "This is home now," as Norton collapsed, consumed by fear and helplessness. Inside a church in Gideon Falls, Father Fred delivered a sermon addressing the congregation about their shared suffering. He acknowledged the town's dark history of terrible crimes and posed a critical question. What comes next? His words urged the community to choose unity over fear and mistrust, challenging them to become stronger together. As he spoke, Father Fred was suddenly struck by a vision. As reality began to shift, images of Norton Sinclair and fragmented memories overwhelmed him, accompanied by a plea for help. The overwhelming scene left him disoriented. Suddenly the trance broke, and Father Fred found himself in an empty, desolate church with no congregation in sight. two strangers burst into the church. They brought alarming news. Abel Lacroix had gone missing, taken from his bedroom. They explained the escalating violence in Gideon Falls, revealing that 12 murders had occurred in less than a month, and this marked the 13th. The strangers pressed Fred, demanding action, but an unknown sheriff pleaded for caution, warning against the danger of mob justice. One of the men revealed that there had been a witness this time, and the identity of the killer was now known. The name stunned Fred: Norton Sinclair. Suddenly, everyone vanished, and Fred found himself standing in the church alone. Right then, Sheriff Miller entered, addressing Fred's confusion. She informed him it was Wednesday, and there had been no sermon. Fred, baffled, insisted he had been delivering his speech to a full church moments ago. Realizing something strange had occurred, Fred expressed his unease. Outside, Miller and Fred discussed the events. She revealed a recollection sparked by Fred's recent visit. Joe Reddy, the bus driver from her childhood, had been present before her brother Daniel's disappearance. Miller recounted how Reddy would drive her and Daniel to school every day, tying him to her haunting memories of the past. She explained that after Reddy's death, her deputies searched his farm but found nothing. Still, she wanted to revisit the farm and invited Fred along, hoping a fresh perspective might help. Fred agreed, but before joining her, he paused, asking if the name Norton Sinclair meant anything to her. Meanwhile, Dr. Shu confronted the hospital receptionist, demanding to see Norton Sinclair. She asserted her role as his doctor, not a visitor. Dr. Donald Kadri interrupted, taking charge of the situation and informing Shu that she was no longer assigned to Norton. Kadri accused her of acting inappropriately with the patient, referencing an alleged physical relationship. Shu, outraged, defended her actions and criticized Kadri for overstepping his authority by taking Norton from his apartment. Kadri dismissed her protests, asserting that Norton belonged in the hospital. In his cell, Norton sat curled up, tormented by the haunting voice in his mind. The voice urged him to look where others wouldn't, promising that the answers he sought would make him whole. Despite his fear, Norton was drawn into the darkness. He saw a vision of walking down his old orphanage basement and finding a key. At Joe Reddy's abandoned farmhouse, Miller and Fred arrived to investigate. Miller didn't hesitate to break in, jokingly telling Fred, "Age before beauty." Inside, Fred asked if Reddy had been investigated during her brother's disappearance. Miller revealed that Reddy had been questioned, but provided an alibi. He was playing poker with the sheriff at the time. Miller revealed that her father had said Reddy even helped with the search efforts at the time. Fred suggested asking Miller's father about another name, Norton Sinclair, but Miller admitted she had never heard of him. Fred recounted his earlier vision in the church, describing it as more of a memory than a vision. He said it felt like he was seeing and following someone else's memory, leaving Miller intrigued, yet puzzled. As they explored the farmhouse, Fred sensed something unusual and felt a presence in the room. Miller cautiously investigated, and they discovered a hidden object behind a wall. Miller retrieved an old shoebox wrapped in plastic and opened it to find photographs. As they examined the images, Fred noticed one photo depicting a man in a mask and scarf. It was a photo of Norton. Fred, completely disturbed, admitted he had no idea who the person was. Chapter 3. The Transfiguration. Father Fred and Sheriff Miller sat in Miller's car, examining the photographs found in the shoebox. Miller asked if Fred recognized the masked man in the photo, but Fred admitted he didn't. Miller thought the man looked familiar, but couldn't place him. When they speculated on the location, they agreed it could be any city. Miller suggested taking the box to her father for further insight, and Fred agreed. As they drove, Fred questioned why Miller had brought him to Reddy's property instead of her deputies. Miller explained that her deputies hadn't experienced the strange occurrences they had, and hinted that the investigation was far from normal. Fred admitted to having visions, describing how he saw Reddy in the mirror and the past events in the church. Miller was intrigued but unsettled by his revelations. Fred then shared a personal confession about his past. He revealed that 10 years ago, in a parish in Colorado, he had developed feelings for a parishioner named Rebecca and entered into an inappropriate relationship with her. When her husband discovered the affair, Rebecca tragically hanged herself in Fred's church. Haunted by this event, Fred admitted it shaped his life ever since. Miller reacted with shock but empathy, acknowledging the weight of Fred's past as they drove on. Fred noted that their shared experiences connected them in a way others wouldn't understand, hinting that their ordeal was just beginning. Meanwhile, at the mental institution, Angela Shu observed Dr. Kadri leaving. She prepared a syringe, determined to bypass security and reach Norton. Using her access key, Angela made her way through the facility and injected an orderly with a sedative. She encountered other patients before finding Norton's cell. Her determination was evident as she pushed forward. Dr. Shu found Norton in a stark, tiled cell at the mental institution, curled up and seemingly lost in his thoughts. She called out to him, gently trying to break through his haze, reassuring him of her presence. Norton clutched something in his hand, whispering about the key he had found. Dr. Shu assured him that she was there to help him escape. Placing Norton in a wheelchair, Dr. Shu navigated the dim corridors, determined to find a way out. Norton, still disoriented, mentioned seeing the laughing man in the basement and described it as a vision of the past, almost like reliving someone else's memory. Dr. Shu, though focused on the immediate escape, expressed empathy for Norton's condition, acknowledging the surreal nature of their situation. Meanwhile, Miller and Fred met Doc Sutton, Miller's father, to discuss the photo found in the shoebox. Miller asked if he recognized the masked man, speculating it might be her missing brother, Daniel. Sutton dismissed the idea, suggesting it could be anyone. Miller, however, remained convinced that Reddy's connection to Daniel's disappearance was significant. She expressed frustration over the lack of clear answers, feeling burdened by the unresolved mystery. In Sutton's room, covered with newspaper clippings and conspiracy-like evidence, Miller vented her anger. She accused her father of holding back and failing to acknowledge the gravity of what they were uncovering. Sutton, though patient, tried to calm her down, explaining that the weight of these mysteries extended far beyond their comprehension. Fred attempted to mediate, but Miller dismissed his involvement, labeling it a family matter. As tensions escalated, Miller stormed out, intent on pursuing the investigation on her own terms. Sutton confided in Fred about Miller's emotional struggles, revealing the pain surrounding her brother's disappearance and the loss of her mother. Fred, understanding the depth of the family's trauma, empathized with their shared burden of grief and uncertainty. Fred asked Sutton about the name Norton Sinclair. Hearing the name, Doc Sutton was left completely shocked. He said that Norton Sinclair was a serial killer, Gideon Falls' first serial killer. The day he was killed was the first time the black barn appeared. Dr. Shu gently removed Norton's mask and bandages, carefully attending to his injuries. Norton thanked her, expressing his reliance on her support. Dr. Shu reassured him, declaring their partnership in navigating the strange events they faced. They arrived at their destination, a location Norton identified as the former site of his childhood orphanage. Standing outside, Norton affirmed his certainty about the address. Inside a coffee shop now occupying the location, Norton and Dr. Shu noted the changes in the neighborhood since his youth. Dr. Shu questioned Norton about the key he mentioned earlier, confirming it was tied to the basement of the building. When they requested access to the restrooms, the barista declined, insisting they purchase something first. Dr. Shu rolled her eyes at Norton's exaggerated order of a venti half-caff mochaccino with extra whip, teasing him about his newfound coffee preferences. Afterward, they descended into the building's basement. Norton recognized the space, recalling it as where he had seen the key. They carefully navigated the dark, eerie environment. Norton led the way, driven by his memories, while Dr. Shu followed, flashlight in hand. The two arrived at a locked door, prompting Norton to use a scalpel to break in. Once inside, Norton searched through piles of debris and old belongings, looking for something specific. Dr. Shu remained alert, checking on him occasionally. Finally, Norton unearthed a small golden key. Holding it up triumphantly, he turned to Dr. Shu and stated with conviction, "We have the door, and now we have the key. Time to see where it leads." Chapter 4: The Hypostatic Union. Doc Sutton recounted the dark history of Gideon Falls, beginning with the fall of 1886, one of the town's darkest periods. A series of gruesome killings unfolded, where victims were butchered and displayed like trophies. By Christmas, 12 men and women had been murdered. A witness to one of the murders described a smiling man, but days later, that witness took their own life. Another witness came forward a week later and identified Norton Sinclair as the killer. Sheriff Burke and a posse gathered to confront Sinclair after a local man, Abel Lacroix, went missing. They surrounded Sinclair's property, a dilapidated farm with a barn glowing ominously red. The group demanded Sinclair surrender, but when he refused, they stormed the barn. Inside, chaos erupted. The group encountered disturbing visions, a swirling red vortex, and other unexplainable phenomena. Norton Sinclair, Abel Lacroix, and several others vanished without a trace. Witnesses Witnesses were left horrified, and Sinclair's barn disappeared as if it had never existed. Doc Sutton shared these events with Father Fred. He explained that the disappearances and supernatural elements had led Father Jacob Burke to the formation of the Plowmen, a group dedicated to uncovering the truth about the Black Barn and its ties to Gideon Falls' tragedies. Doc admitted there were still gaps he had been trying to fill for years. Fred inquired about Sinclair's farm, asking if it still existed. Doc revealed that the land had been turned into a landfill. While searching for old maps to pinpoint the property's location, Doc appeared visibly disturbed. Overcome with emotion, he collapsed mid-conversation. Fred, alarmed, called out for help as he held Doc in his arms. Dr. Shue and Norton took refuge in a cluttered room with shelves of jars. Norton expressed unease, feeling that something was still missing. Dr. Shue warned that they couldn't stay there, as Dr. Kadri and the hospital staff would likely search the location first. Norton agreed, but insisted they needed to return to the vacant lot where they had found the mysterious door. He believed the lot held a unique power that might lead to answers. Dr. Shue admitted she had felt the unsettling energy of the place, but it scared her. Norton reassured her, explaining that he felt destined to uncover the truth, even though the outcome remained unclear. When Dr. Shue questioned where this journey would ultimately lead, Norton admitted he didn't know. He speculated that the Black Barn represented something beyond conventional concepts of good and evil. Dr. Shue expressed skepticism, viewing the barn as purely malevolent, but Norton countered that it might hold all the secrets they were seeking. Meanwhile, Fred and Deputy Ballard stood in a hospital hallway, looking in on Doc Sutton, who lay in critical condition on life support after a massive heart attack. Miller sat beside her father. Fred and a deputy discussed the complex relationship between Miller and Doc, acknowledging the difficulty she would face if he passed. Fred requested the deputy to inform Miller that he was heading to the town dump, relating to their investigation into Norton Sinclair. Before leaving, Fred received a mysterious call from Bishop. The caller instructed Fred to remember one critical detail: to find him when he arrived at an unspecified destination. Fred was puzzled about how Bishop knew he was at the hospital, but listened intently to the cryptic instructions. As Fred repeated the message to confirm, the line went dead, leaving him standing alone with unanswered questions. Norton and Dr. Shue arrived at the landfill, dragging salvaged wooden boards from the dismantled structure. As they prepared to unload, Dr. Shue asked if Norton was okay. Norton seemed distracted, claiming he heard something faint but uncertain of its source. Suddenly he exclaimed and turned toward the sound, startled. He spotted the apparition of his younger self standing eerily still. Entranced, Norton watched as the child ran deeper into the landfill. Norton muttered that this was where everything began for him, the place where the mysterious pieces he had been collecting originated. Gaining clarity, he pieced together his memories and explained to Dr. Shue that he had not come from the street across the lot, but from the trash itself. Meanwhile, Father Fred also appeared at the landfill, standing before the trash piles. He saw Daniel Sutton as a boy, guided by Joe Reddy. Joe reassured Daniel not to be scared, urging him to go a little further. Fred called out to him, Joe Reddy, but received no response as they vanished. Norton became increasingly driven, instructing Dr. Shue to help him assemble the salvaged boards. He assured her they would fit together perfectly to create something significant. Meanwhile, Father Fred sifted through the trash, uncovering debris from the Black Barn. As Norton and Dr. Shue finished assembling the structure, Norton declared, "It's almost time," before hammering the final piece into place. Fred continued searching through the trash and discovered a piece of smashed ground, as though a building once stood there. In the debris, he found a key. At the same time, Norton pulled out the key he had obtained from the orphanage. As he inserted the key into the door and turned it, the Black Barn materialized before both Norton and Fred. Dr. Shue warned Norton to stay back, but he insisted he had to know the truth and stepped inside. Miller arrived at the landfill and screamed at Fred not to enter the barn. Fred reassured her, saying she would come back, and entered as well. Inside, Father Fred and Norton, now in apparition forms, stood face to face. Baffled, Fred asked, "Who the hell are you?" Chapter 5. Did I find you, or did you find me? Father Fred confronted Norton, addressing him as Daniel Sutton. Norton denied being Daniel, affirming his identity as Norton Sinclair. However, he said that he remembered the name. The tension escalated as an enigmatic figure emerged, clad in a suit and fedora. The figure, ominously confident, claimed to be the real Norton Sinclair. He declared, "No, you are not. I am." Norton and Fred were left bewildered by the figure's presence. The suited man man dismissed their confusion with a cryptic remark, adding to the mystery. He invited them further, stepping aside to reveal a stairway leading to a strange, surreal environment. Fred and Norton followed the figure down the path, arriving at a peculiar contraption, a large mechanical device with a glowing orb. The man introduced the contraption as something monumental, claiming he had succeeded in creating it after years of effort. Norton and Fred looked on, visibly confused, as the man turned a lever, causing the device to activate. The activation sent shockwaves through the environment, distorting their perception. The suited man, ecstatic, proclaimed that his invention was functioning as intended. He hinted at its purpose, declaring it was not just a machine, but a gateway to an ultimate truth. As the machine roared to life, reality seemed to fracture. Images of multiple dimensions, realities, and versions of Gideon Falls emerged, creating a kaleidoscopic vision of fragmented cities and worlds. The suited man, reveling in the chaos, introduced the viewers to his many kingdoms. The man said that there was something else in those kingdoms, and something between the dimensions, and then he began to transform grotesquely. Insects poured out of his mouth as his body contorted, revealing legs of a monstrous insect coming out of his back. The man's body fell down as the monstrous insect fully emerged from his back. Lying in his own blood, the man said that the entity was from between worlds, and it smiled at him. It knew his name, and their names as well, and now it was very, very hungry. The entity was none other than the Laughing Man. He commanded Norton to become its doorway, attempting to draw him closer. Fred, sensing the danger, pushed Norton aside and confronted the being, yelling at Norton to run. The creature mocked Fred, calling him the faller of trees as it attempted to consume them both. Norton fled in terror, while Fred struggled to resist the overwhelming presence. Norton screamed at Fred to get away, but the Laughing Man raised one of its giant insect legs and hit Fred. It attacked Fred from forehead to chest, marking him with a gaping wound. Hurt and bleeding, Fred prayed to the Lord, requesting help to get back home. The Laughing Man answered instead, speaking ominously about a singular home that pulls everything into darkness. Fred and Norton ran as the Laughing Man chased them, when suddenly their forms began to disintegrate into tiles of possibilities and fell apart like a stack of cards. Norton materialized into the real world, in the landfill, screaming. Sheriff Clara Miller stood in front of him. She called out to him, "Daniel! Danny! Is that you?" Norton could only stare in bafflement and reply, "Where am I?" Father Fred also materialized at the landfill. In front of her stood Dr. Angie Shu, who said, Who the hell are you?" To which Fred replied, I don't know. Fred and Norton had swapped dimensions from different versions of Gideon Falls, and Fred had lost his memories. Act 3, Stations of the Cross. Chapter 1, The Laughing Man, Part 1. In 1886, a church meeting grew tense as townsfolk reported the mysterious disappearance of Abel Lacroix, allegedly taken from his bedroom. The sheriff tried to calm the crowd, urging patience, but a witness identified the culprit as Norton Sinclair. Tension escalated when the mob gathered outside Sinclair's residence, demanding Abel's release. Father Burke accompanied the group, cautioning the sheriff. As they entered the residence, they encountered a machine with glowing red orbs. Reality fragmented, and everyone lost their senses. After some time, Father Burke regained consciousness. He witnessed the Laughing Man tearing into the flesh of one of the people. The figure raised his head and said, "Hello, Father. Come for dinner?" Horrified by the carnage, Burke demanded answers about what Norton had done. The Laughing Man cryptically claimed to have breached the wall and discovered unimaginable truths, declaring, "I've found everything, everywhere." The Laughing Man then threw a switch, summoning a glowing red orb. Multiple versions of Gideon Falls appeared in fragmented displays, revealing layers of alternate realities. "You are not Norton Sinclair," Burke said. The Laughing Man replied, "I'm the one who smiles in the dark." The entity mocked Burke as he stumbled through an unstable, shifting reality filled with distorted versions of Gideon Falls and other bizarre landscapes. Burke, determined to follow, leapt after the Laughing Man, hurtling through a surreal landscape. The city twisted and morphed into impossible, otherworldly configurations, leaving Burke disoriented as he pursued the entity through the fractured dimensions. Father Burke found himself in an arid desert under a blazing sun, disoriented and parched. The vast, barren landscape stretched endlessly as he stumbled forward, seeking a sign of civilization. In the distance, a small town came into view. As he approached the town, he observed a grim scene. Bodies were strewn in the streets, and the townsfolk appeared shaken. He asked what had happened, and a frightened frightened woman replied haltingly that a man had come, leaving death and destruction in his wake. A wary local advised Burke to move along, warning that tensions were high and strangers were unwelcome. Burke's attention shifted to a saloon, and he entered. The bartender greeted him tersely, acknowledging his presence as a priest. Burke inquired about the man responsible for the chaos. The bartender revealed the man had fled on horseback an hour earlier, pursued by the sheriff and some townsfolk. The bartender asked if Burke knew the man, to which he replied cryptically, "Thought I did." Burke requested a horse to pursue the man, insisting he was a capable rider and had faith on his side. The bartender, after some hesitation, directed him to the livery, offering one of his own horses and advising Burke to mention his name, Jed Hopkins, to avoid trouble. As Burke prepared to leave, he asked one final question, the name of the town. Jed smirked and replied, "This here is Gideon Falls, father." Burke exited the saloon, determined, adjusting his collar as he readied himself to confront the laughing man. Later, Father Burke rode through the desert at dusk, his horse's hooves kicking up dust as the horizon darkened. Upon reaching a small outpost, he carefully dismounted, soothing the nervous animal. He noticed blood smeared across his fingers, perplexed by its presence. Steeling himself, he called out, announcing his peaceful intentions, and advanced cautiously toward the gathering area. Spotting a blood trail, Burke followed it to a cross silhouetted against the rising moon. The ominous sight compelled him to call out for Sinclair, his voice echoing into the silence. As he approached, his eyes widened in shock at the gruesome scene before him. 3 men were nailed to crosses, their lifeless bodies illuminated by the moonlight. Blood ran down the wooden beams, pooling at their bases, while crows perched on the grisly display. Burke was paralyzed by the horror of the scene when a sinister voice pierced the air, chilling him to the bone. The voice warned him that he should not have followed, claiming, "This is not meant for you, father. It is mine." Determined yet unnerved, Burke pushed forward, eventually finding himself before the blackened and foreboding structure of the mysterious barn. A single crimson light glowed from within, casting a shadow over the land. As he hesitated, the laughing man's haunting visage emerged, declaring with eerie certainty, "He is mine." The entity mocked Burke, taunting him with claims of possession. Despite his fear, Burke clutched his rosary tightly, whispering a desperate prayer to the Virgin Mary, seeking protection and strength, and hurled himself into the barn. Father Burke stumbled as he felt reality break apart again, shattering into fragmented visuals and chaotic impressions. Desperately, he regained his footing and muttered a prayer under his breath. The disorienting environment shifted, and he found himself in a new, alien reality. As he knelt on the ground, he observed a strange cityscape filled with floating airships and a massive cross dominating the skyline. Stunned, he whispered, "Dear God," overwhelmed by the strange surroundings. He walked through this mysterious version of Gideon Falls, arriving at a building marked Paper and Stationery. Inside, he encountered a shopkeeper engrossed in work, surrounded by an eclectic mix of items. The shopkeeper initially paid him little attention, but Burke's actions quickly drew his notice. Burke grabbed paper and began furiously sketching, muttering about needing to map his surroundings. The shopkeeper, startled and indignant, demanded to know what Burke thought he was doing. Burke explained almost to himself that he was making a map. The crude drawing depicted links between multiple realities, labeling locations as Gideon II, Frontier, Gideon III, Steam, and Sinclair's Barn. The origin of the realities read, Home. Holding the map with a mix of trepidation and resolve, he admitted, "God help me, I think I'm going to need it." Chapter 2. The Laughing Man, Part 2. After Father Burke finished drawing the map, an unsettling scream pierced the air. The man accompanying him in the stationery shop questioned the source of the disturbance. Father Burke rushed outside to investigate, clearly distressed, repeating, "No, no, no," as he stumbled upon a gruesome scene. Outside, chaos had erupted. A man lay brutally injured, his blood pooling on the cobblestone street. Pieces of machinery, resembling mechanical drones, hovered nearby. Father Burke knelt beside the injured man, attempting to comfort him, whispering, "Hold on, son, the Lord is with you." As other people gathered up, Burke requested them to tend to the wounded and ran behind the assailant. As Father Burke turned his attention further down the street, he spotted a lone figure in the shadows, a woman holding her abdomen, blood seeping through her dress. She uttered, "He had such a smile," her face streaked with tears. Burke, shaken and confused, muttered, "Sinclair?" as he ventured deeper into the darkness. In Inside the looming shadows, he called out for Norton. His voice echoed as he warned Norton that there was no escape. The laughing man stood before him with glowing red eyes and a haunting grin. The figure declared, "You are wrong. There is always somewhere else to go." Saying this, the laughing man launched a brutal attack with a shard of glass and slashed Burke's left eye. Clutching his bleeding face, Burke recoiled, screaming in pain. Desperately, he demanded answers, shouting, "What are you?" Right then, a black hole converged at the center of Gideon Falls. As Burke ran after the laughing man, reality began to break again as the laughing man declared, "I am the shadow at the center." Burke, overwhelmed by the surreal and disjointed nature of the multiple realities converging around Gideon Falls, found himself thrust into a dystopian version of the town. The cityscape became surreal, dominated by towering structures and an oppressive atmosphere, underscored by banners proclaiming, "Gideon Falls watches you." Father Burke stumbled into an altered reality, visibly injured, his priestly collar marking him as a target. As he attempted to make sense of his surroundings, a group of armored enforcers confronted him. They accused him of violating strict rules against religious symbols, deeming his collar illegal. Their hostility intensified, and despite Burke's pleas for help and explanation, they assaulted him brutally, rendering him unconscious. Later, Burke awoke in a dark, claustrophobic cell, disoriented and battered. The oppressive atmosphere was heightened by haunting, disembodied voices taunting him. One voice, familiar yet chilling, addressed him mockingly. It belonged to Sinclair, whose silhouette loomed ominously in the shadows. Sinclair revealed that he too had been captured but seemed changed, an extension of the malevolent force that had ensnared the town. As Burke tried to reason with Sinclair, he implored him to fight the dark influence overtaking him, appealing to his faith and inner strength. Sinclair cryptically mentioned the Pentoculus and questioned why Burke had survived an encounter with it, emphasizing that only he had been deemed special enough to endure its effects. Burke warned him that the entity was the king of lies, but Norton, emotionally unstable, recounted how the entity had promised him greatness and showed him the center of everything. He admitted he had seen the entity smiling at him from the shadows, then broke down and began crying over the unspeakable things the entity had made him do. Burke pleaded for Norton to resist, assuring him that it wasn't too late to fight back with faith. However, Norton mocked Burke's invocation of God, laughing maniacally and dismissing the notion of divine help. He declared he would show Burke the true Lord and ominously remarked about his future tasks. Norton began to transform into the laughing man. Cockroach legs protruded from his back, and he broke open both his cell and Burke's. Fully overtaken by the entity, Norton asked, "Are you coming?" Burke resisted, shouting for him to stop. Norton, taunting him, simply replied, "Make me." A blinding light enveloped everything as reality began to distort. When the light subsided, Burke found himself battered in a serene, forested landscape. Disoriented, he stumbled through the woods until he discovered a small, quiet village. As he approached, he cautiously called out for anyone. The village was eerily silent until voices emerged, exclaiming that his arrival marked the fulfillment of a prophecy. Bewildered by the cryptic remarks, Burke watched as a group of villagers wearing masks approached him. The group, led by a shirtless man, announced, "Welcome, Bishop. We've been waiting for you." Chapter 3. The Village Near the Center. Burke faced a group of masked villagers standing solemnly before him. Confused, he asked, "What is this?" The shirtless man, seemingly their leader, calmly explained they had been waiting for him, as per his request. Overwhelmed, Burke protested, claiming ignorance. Clutching his face in pain, he collapsed to the ground while the crowd called out, "Bishop!" Later, Burke found himself lying down, disoriented and surrounded by fragmented visions. Whispered voices discussed his state, expressing urgency about bringing him to the church. However, one voice insisted he required rest, hinting someone was coming to guide him. Burke murmured, questioning the reality of his situation. A woman's voice confirmed it had all begun, calling it truth. Burke woke on a bed of straw inside a wooden building. Torches illuminated a cross on the wall. The shirtless man and several masked villagers stood around him. The man greeted him warmly, asking if he felt better. Burke, still confused, demanded to know who they were. A young woman stepped forward, referring to themselves as his children and his flock, part of a village near the center. Burke questioned their repeated use of bishop, insisting he wasn't who they thought he was. The shirtless man cryptically explained that Bishop was who Burke would become in the future. Burke rejected their claims, asserting he didn't know them. The woman clarified testified he would visit them many times when older. She handed him a yellowed piece of paper, revealing it was a map he had supposedly left for them. On it, timelines and cryptic symbols were drawn. Still bewildered, Burke demanded answers about Norton Sinclair, the entity, and the chaos unfolding. The woman reassured him they were safe in the darkness for now. At that moment, an old lady entered and asked Burke to follow her, as they did not have much time. Burke observed the village preparing for a looming threat. He asked the old woman leading him, "What is going on?" She responded gravely, saying the village would soon be attacked. Burke demanded to know by whom, and she explained that Reddy, Norton Sinclair, and other entities were rallying the tribes of darkness. She told Burke that he must begin gathering the sacred. Though he grew frustrated and demanded clarity, the old woman led him to a large cross surrounded by discarded smaller ones. She said the 5 sacred figures would come soon, and Burke would send them forth. She identified these 5 as the madman, the soldier, the sinner, the doctor, and the father, all linked to the Pentoculus. Burke, confused, recognized the term as something Norton Sinclair had spoken of and pressed for more answers. She guided Burke into a church, revealing a massive machine with glowing red orbs. Shocked, Burke asked how it was built, and the woman cryptically answered that Burke himself had brought it there. She handed him blueprints, saying he would need them. The drawings depicted the same machine, but Burke struggled to understand its purpose. The woman explained that the village's proximity to the center altered the flow of time, meaning decades would pass in his world upon his return. As she switched on the machine, Burke witnessed the Pentoculus, a swirling mass of energy representing the connection between worlds. The woman assured Burke that this was vital to the fight against the darkness. She promised they would meet again, though when they did, she wouldn't recognize him. The old woman was none other than Dr. Angela Shue. Burke, overwhelmed, stared into the fragmented visions of realities colliding and converging onto him, his mind assaulted by the incomprehensible chaos. Burke woke up in a hospital bed, startled and disoriented. A nurse greeted him, asking if he could hear her. He groggily asked where he was, and the nurse explained he was in Gideon Falls. Struggling to comprehend, Burke muttered his name, Father Jeremiah Burke. The nurse confirmed his identity, but seemed puzzled as Burke asked if this was his Gideon. Moments later, the sheriff entered with a deputy, reassuring the nurse that Burke needed rest. Addressing Burke directly, the sheriff revealed that Gideon Falls once had a Father Jeremiah Burke, nearly 50 years ago. Alarmed, Burke demanded to know the current year, and the sheriff responded it was 1953. This revelation left Burke visibly shaken. Burke's anxiety heightened as he urgently requested paper and a pencil, insisting he had to write everything down before he forgot. Both the sheriff and the deputy tried to calm him, questioning what he needed to remember. Burke emphasized the importance of recording what he had seen and experienced. The sheriff mentioned folders containing mathematical equations and strange documents, which they had retrieved at the station. Burke insisted on having them, declaring they were critical to understanding his mission. The scene transitioned to now, showing a grand cathedral under the night sky. Inside, a high-ranking cardinal meticulously prepared himself, donning religious attire and a false eye. A meticulous montage showed his ritualistic preparations, emphasizing the gravity of his role. Standing before a massive painting of Christ's suffering, the cardinal addressed his gathered subordinates. He declared that one of their ranks, Wilfred Quinn, had gone missing. His disappearance, coupled with the reappearance of the Black Barn, signaled that it was beginning. The cardinal emphasized the urgency of finding Father Wilfred, declaring that the situation marked the start of something monumental. The cardinal was Bishop Burke, and his gathered 5 stood in front of him. They said, "Yes, Bishop Burke, we understand." Chapter 4. The Misplaced Man. Father Fred, disoriented and confused, found himself in a dark and desolate environment. He appeared lost, and when he encountered Dr. Shue, she immediately demanded, "Who are you?" He responded in confusion, admitting, "I don't know." Dr. Shue, suspicious and alert, began searching for someone named Norton, shouting his name into the emptiness. She asked if Fred had seen another person, describing Norton as a young man with dark hair. Fred denied seeing him. Their conversation was tense as they navigated what seemed to be ruins, with Dr. Shu repeatedly calling for Norton. Fred followed her, uncertain about his surroundings. As he ventured further, he came across a group of vagrants warming themselves by a fire under an overpass. Desperate for answers, he asked them where he was. The vagrants mocked his confusion, one of them laughingly remarking, "Man, you're messed up." Another claimed to recognize him, adding, "I've seen you all over the place," but their answers were vague and unhelpful. Fred asked them for his name, but they dismissed his question, saying, "Whatever you want it to be." One of them handed him a bottle of alcohol, urging him to drink. As he stared at his reflection in the bottle, he began to see visions of a black barn in a blood-red field. Overwhelmed, he drank from the bottle. Meanwhile, Dr. Shu continued her search for Norton. She entered Norton's room filled with jars and medical instruments, calling his name again. Her search seemed fruitless, leaving an eerie sense of unresolved tension as she scanned the space, her voice echoing in the silence. She stood in front of the maps of Gideon Falls, marked with red X's indicating specific locations. She closely studied the markings, her attention drawn to their patterns. As she prepared for the next step, her hands moved cautiously, picking up a white mask from a nearby table. The mask seemed significant, holding an air of mystery. She gazed at it intently before putting it on, a shadow of determination crossing her face. Meanwhile, Father Fred wandered alone through the rain-soaked ruins. His path led him to a door where he knocked hesitantly. He shifted into a dreamlike state where he saw Rebecca, demanding to know if Fred planned to leave her standing in the rain all night. Fred fell down on the ground, still dreaming about Rebecca. In his dread, Rebecca said, "He knows." Fred, visibly alarmed, tried to calm her, asking what had happened. Rebecca's paranoia escalated, claiming someone had discovered them, yet Fred dismissed her concerns, trying to rationalize the situation. And then, Fred saw Rebecca's hanging feet. Two masked men discovered Father Fred lying unconscious. As they attempted to wake him, Wilfred lashed out violently, yelling for them to leave him alone. He punched one of them and ran like a madman. Meanwhile, Dr. Shu received a phone call from her office assistant, Melissa, who expressed concern over her absence and missed appointments. Dr. Shu, visibly distracted and unwell, dismissed the conversation, eventually discarding her phone into a nearby trash can. She stood in an alley surrounded by towering bags of garbage, her world seemingly inverted as she tried to maintain focus. Elsewhere, Father Fred wandered the rain-soaked streets, narrowly dodging a speeding car that screeched to a halt. The driver angrily honked, but Fred was more focused on a figure in the distance. He squinted through the downpour, trying to discern who was calling his name. His confusion turned to horror as he stumbled upon Rebecca's lifeless body hanging from a lamppost, swinging gently in the rain. Fred called out to her in anguish, his voice breaking. As he approached, Rebecca's corpse began to speak, accusing him of uncovering a terrible secret. Her words were fragmented and filled with despair, leaving Fred overwhelmed with guilt. Suddenly, her body transformed grotesquely, her face consumed by crawling insects. She taunted him with chilling promises of retribution, her voice echoing in his mind. Slowly, her face morphed into that of the laughing man. Fred came back to his senses again and found an old phone. It was as if he could hear it ring. He suddenly got a flash of a memory where someone had given him the task to find him. Fred kept looking at the phone and uttered the name. "Bishop?" Back in the alley, Dr. Shu sifted through the refuse, her hands unearthing a blood-stained piece of cloth. Startled but determined, she held the fabric, inspecting it closely as her unease deepened. It was Fred's collar. She glanced around nervously, aware that danger lurked nearby, but determined to push forward. Father Fred, shaken and disoriented, trudged through the rain, running away from the men who chased him. His attention was drawn to a discarded pipe on the ground, which he cautiously picked up, sensing an imminent threat. As he gripped the weapon, the voice of the laughing man echoed, "You got secrets in your belly." Alarmed, Fred swung wildly at the air, his fear mounting. Dr. Shu appeared abruptly, urging him to stop. Her hands raised defensively, she exclaimed, "Stop!" Fred, still on edge, recognized her faintly, muttering, I know you." She remained composed, carefully gesturing for calm. Dr. Shu handed him a bloodied strip of cloth, stating, "I think this is yours." Fred took it, inspecting the grim reminder of his injuries. As they spoke, Dr. Shu presented Fred with a sheet of paper. It was Norton's sketch of the ominous black barn. Her voice trembled slightly as she asked, "What do you know about the black barn?" Chapter 5. All Those Little Scars. In their childhood, Clara and Daniel ran through a forest at sunset, with Clara leading. Danny hesitated, reminding her they weren't supposed to be there, as their father, Doc Sutton, had forbidden it. Clara dismissed his concerns, mocking how he sounded increasingly like their father. She climbed a tree to get a better view, urging Danny to follow. Reluctantly, Danny joined her. From the treetop, Clara pointed out the view and encouraged Danny to climb higher. However, Danny's attention shifted when he noticed a shadowy figure on the ground below, the laughing man smiling his sinister smile with glowing red eyes. Danny froze, his fear evident as Clara tried to coax him forward. Suddenly, Danny lost his footing, slipping from the tree. Clara reached out desperately to grab him, but he fell, hitting the ground hard. The impact left Danny injured and bleeding, with blood streaming from his mouth. Clara quickly climbed down to check on him, panic and concern overtaking her. Right then, Danny got his first vision of the ominous black barn. As Clara helped Danny back to their house, his injuries worsened, and he muttered about seeing something ominous. They hurried to their father, Doc Sutton, who scolded them for causing such a commotion. Clara explained what happened, and Doc, alarmed, led Danny into his study, an off-limits room filled with newspaper clippings and diagrams about a mysterious black barn. Danny dumbfoundedly looked at them as his father tended to him. He treated Danny's injuries while chastising Clara for allowing him to climb so high. He reminded Clara of her responsibility to protect Danny, emphasizing how much Danny looked up to her. Clara, guilt-ridden, promised to be more careful as Doc Sutton continued his quiet, intense research on the black barn. At present, Clara approached Norton at the landfill. He was disoriented, his hands stained with blood. She called him Danny, but he insisted his name was Norton Sinclair and appeared visibly confused. Clara persisted, telling him he was Daniel Sutton and that he was home. She removed his mask and touched the scar on his mouth, a mark from the past. She called him her brother, but Norton resisted the name, questioning her claims and asking about someone named Angie. Clara tried to calm him, suggesting he might be confused, and asked where he had been. Norton replied that he had been in Gideon Falls, but Clara countered that they were already in Gideon Falls, highlighting a contradiction in his memory. Norton, still in disbelief, questioned everything, struggling to reconcile Clara's assertions with his own fragmented memories. Clara gently proposed taking him to where he grew up, believing it might help him remember. Norton, overwhelmed by the situation, reluctantly agreed. They arrived at a house filled with books, which Clara identified as his home. She asked if he remembered anything about the place, but Norton remained uncertain. She mentioned that he had disappeared from there at the age of 9, which aligned with Norton's memory of arriving in the city and the orphanage at that age. Clara asked if he remembered a man named Joe Reddy, but Norton's expression remained blank. Curiosity led Norton Doc Sutton's lab, labelled Keep Out. Clara identified it as their father's study. Norton touched the door, seemingly drawn to it as Clara cautiously watched. She addressed him as Dan Norton, struggling to reconcile his conflicting identities. Norton entered Doc Sutton's room. Its walls were covered in clippings, diagrams, and sketches of the black barn. The space had an unnatural quality, with objects floating and the red stains on the floor emanating an ominous glow. Norton whispered, "The barn," as fragmented memories stirred in his mind. Suddenly overwhelmed, he staggered back, clutching his head as visions of the barn flashed in his mind. Clara rushed to his side, calling him Danny, her voice full of concern. Norton struggled against the onslaught of memories, collapsing to the floor. Clara's attempts to help were met with resistance as Norton crawled away, gripping his mask tighter as if it were his last anchor to reality. He retreated into the bathroom, shaking and panicked, where he vomited violently, unable to reconcile the conflicting memories and the strange pull of the barn. Clara followed him cautiously, asking if he was okay. Norton barely managed to compose himself and muttered no as beads of sweat ran down his face. He looked up at the mirror and, to his horror, saw the demonic face of the laughing man with glowing red eyes staring back. He screamed and punched the glass, shattering it into pieces. Clara grabbed him, trying to calm him down, but Norton pulled away, insisting, "My name is Norton Sinclair." Clara, refusing to let go, embraced him tightly and said firmly, "No, you're Danny. You're my little brother." Norton froze, torn between her words and his own fragmented identity. Among the shattered mirror pieces on the floor, the red eyes of the laughing man loomed in each shard, watching silently. Later, Norton and Clara stood in a hospital room. Doc Sutton lay unconscious in the bed, and Clara quietly said, "This is him, our dad." Norton stared at the face, unsure sure but feeling a vague familiarity, whispering, "His face. What happened to him?" Clara revealed that Doc Sutton had suffered a heart attack. Norton, still disoriented, struggled to process the situation. Clara, attempting to comfort him, promised to help him make sense of everything. As the tension lingered, Doc Sutton remained unconscious on the hospital bed. In his unconscious state, Sutton heard a voice saying, "You're home now." When he opened his eyes, he found himself in a surreal, nightmarish vision. His consciousness plunged into a dark, otherworldly realm where he saw an apparition of himself weeping streams of blood. The black barn loomed ominously above, its presence heavy with dread. The malevolent laughing man appeared, confronting Sutton with a mocking, sinister tone. He accused Sutton's son of disobedience, suggesting that the boy's actions had somehow led to this moment. The laughing man ominously declared Sutton to be a doorway, his means of escape. As Sutton recoiled in terror, swarms of insects began crawling over him, forcing their way into his mouth until he could barely breathe. Back in the hospital room, Sutton regained consciousness. Clara softly informed him that Daniel, his son, had come to see him. Still surprised, Sutton looked at Daniel and whispered, "Danny." Clara reassured him that it was indeed Daniel and that he had come back home. Sutton gave a confused smile and asked, "Home?" The shadow of the laughing man reflected on his face, his glowing red eyes. His smile became sinister as he whispered, "Home." Act 4, The Pentoculus, Chapter 1, Forever and Ever. Sutton found himself in a dreamlike state where he saw his children, Clara and Danny, as they once were, young and innocent. He reflected on their unity, longing to return to them, but a malevolent force pulled at him, preventing his awakening. His internal monologue conveyed his awareness of this struggle, yet the influence of the black barn continued to envelop him. In a dark, abstract realm, Sutton heard a voice urging him to be silent and accept his place at the center. The voice led him to a horrifying realization. He was at the core of a vast, interconnected nightmare, the center of everything. As he moved toward the center, he encountered surreal visions of the black barn and was drawn deeper into its dark influence. Sutton protested, declaring his desire to return home, but the sinister voice insisted there was no going back without them completing their journey together. The voice beckoned him closer, urging him to see its face and uncover the truth hidden in the darkness. As he drew near, he was confronted by a monstrous, eldritch entity that embodied chaos and dread. It told him that everything resonated out from the center, repeating endlessly, forever and ever. As Sutton struggled, his soul was devoured by the monstrous entity. Meanwhile, in the other Gideon Falls, Clara and Fred reached Norton's house. She explained that they were at this location due to the disappearance of a friend, believing there must be a connection between the events. Dr. Shu probed further, asking about the last thing Fred remembered. He recounted being in a city garbage dump, but corrected himself, stating he was in Gideon Falls, a small town, and its garbage dump. This revelation intrigued Dr. Shu, who pointed out that Fred had once worn a priest's collar, suggesting a past role as a clergyman. Fred admitted he had lost himself over time, seeking comfort in sobriety. The pair entered a room filled with jars containing strange objects, which Dr. Shu identified as pieces of the black barn. Fred marveled at this collection, referring to the pieces as unsettling evidence of something larger. Dr. Shu handed Fred a drawing of the black barn. Fred started remembering. He said that he had been inside the barn. Dr. Shu pressed Fred about Norton Sinclair, but Fred only vaguely recognized it. A sudden noise from outside the room heightened their tension. Fred dismissed Dr. Shu's concerns, assuming paranoia, and left to investigate. However, he was ambushed by a shadowy figure who gagged him and muttered, "I'm sorry, Father." As Fred lost his senses, the shadowy figure said, "All things for the center." Dr. Shu was similarly rendered unconscious by another man. They were the same men who had followed Fred down the alley. Meanwhile, Norton and Clara sat in the hospital cafeteria, with Clara asking Norton when he last ate. Norton, indifferent, sipped his coffee, stating it was enough. Clara addressed him as Danny, but Norton insisted she call him Norton. Clara tried to jog his memory, asking if he recognized anything about their surroundings. Norton admitted that everything felt familiar, but clarified that familiarity was not the same as remembering. Clara expressed concern for their father, who had seemed alert earlier, but now left her worried. She suggested taking Norton to see a doctor, but her words triggered something in him. Norton suddenly appeared agitated, his mind consumed by an overwhelming realization. He muttered, "Something is missing," and his focus shifted to a nearby trash can. Clara begged him to stop as he approached it, but Norton retrieved a piece of debris, his obsession intensifying. As he held the object subject, fragmented memories and visions of the black barn surged through him. Norton opened his hand, revealing a rusty nail embedded in it. He claimed he had been building the black barn and that it was close now, leaving Clara horrified and confused. In the other dimension, Fred and Dr. Shu found themselves waking up in a stark, unfamiliar room, both disoriented and unsure of their location. Fred, concerned, gently woke Dr. Shu, who appeared shaken but unharmed. As they tried to gather their bearings, their confusion deepened. Dr. Shu asked where they were, to which Fred admitted he had no idea. Moments later, two men entered the room, one apologizing for their previous aggression. They claimed to be allies and mentioned that someone had been waiting for Fred. Suspicious, Fred demanded to know their location, but his questions were met with evasive answers. The two men led Fred and Dr. Shu to an eerie setting dominated by towering crosses. Fred, unsettled, pressed them for clarity. One man alluded to their purpose, referencing Fred's earlier search for someone. Their guide led them to Bishop Burke, an enigmatic figure who seemed to recognize Fred. The bishop greeted Fred with familiarity and commented on the toll his journey had taken. Introducing Dr. Shu, Fred asked for an explanation of the bizarre situation. The bishop addressed Dr. Shu as Angela, marveling at how young she appeared, though she seemed oblivious to the reference. The bishop cryptically mentioned that everything was happening as foretold, expressing urgency and little time for explanations. He gestured toward the massive crosses, stating they held the answers. The bishop revealed a concealed mechanism in one of the crosses, activating it with a mechanical click. He told Fred that he would need to return to Gideon Falls. Fred, startled, admitted he had just come from there and was perplexed by how he was back in this surreal version of the same place. The bishop said that this place was Gideon Falls too, just not his Gideon Falls. He insisted on showing Fred what needed to be done and motioned toward a large, imposing machine in the distance. At the hospital, Clara and Norton heard a chilling scream coming from her father's room. Clara, alarmed, prepared to investigate but instructed Norton to stay behind. Norton insisted on coming along despite Clara's protests. She retrieved a gun for protection, reluctantly agreeing to let Norton follow her. They approached the room cautiously, the air tense with dread. Inside, they discovered Clara's father, Doc Sutton, standing over a blood-soaked body on the bed. His hands and hospital gown were stained in blood. Sutton, visibly shaken, muttered an apology, claiming, "I didn't mean to." The shocking scene left Clara and Norton frozen in disbelief as the horrific reality unfolded. Chapter 2. All of His Kingdoms. Doc Sutton sat distressed, muttering about a face that smiled at him. Smiled and smiled and smiled. Clara demanded answers, trying to make sense of why he killed the man in his room. He appeared confused, denying any malicious intent. Meanwhile, a paramedic worked to secure the body as Clara struggled to calm her father, clearly shaken by the incident. Sheriff Ballard entered, informing Clara that they had discovered something significant. Clara prepared to follow, instructing Norton to stay behind and look after Doc, though Norton firmly reminded her to call him by his chosen name. Frustrated but pressed for time, Clara relented and left with the sheriff. Back in the room, Norton listened as Doc Sutton confessed that the laughing man wanted Norton, claiming he had fought to resist. His voice quivered as he described the sinister smile that haunted him. Norton reassured him, revealing that he too had seen the laughing man's chilling smile, finally affirming, "I believe you." Meanwhile, in the other universe, the bishop explained how Norton Sinclair's device, the Pentaculus, had ripped a supernatural rift in reality, fragmenting Gideon Falls into multiple iterations of itself. Norton's exploration of the rift revealed endless reflections of Gideon Falls, each iteration fracturing and multiplying as though caught in an infinite mirror. Something ominous had emerged from the center of the rift, the Black Barn, connected to all these realities simultaneously. The narration emphasized that this entity had pulled Norton and Clara's father, Doc Sutton, into its labyrinthine existence. Dr. Shu pointed out that Norton was just 27 years old. The bishop revealed that Norton Sinclair was actually Daniel Sutton, Doc Sutton's son, who had been profoundly affected by an encounter with the real Norton Sinclair as a child. Daniel had somehow traveled to this version of Gideon Falls. He had survived the ordeal, but became confused, adopting Sinclair's name as his only memory of the event. A skeptical priest questioned the bishop's theory, theory, calling it implausible and hard to believe. The bishop countered with a theological analogy, likening belief in this strange story to faith in the resurrection of Christ. He then shifted focus to the immediate task, finding Norton and deciphering his connection to the Black Barn. The bishop asserted that 5 key figures, the priest, the doctor, the soldier, the prophet, and the father, had to unite to unravel the mystery and stop the one that smiles. He admitted that he still needed to gather the other 3. Finally, the bishop described his own journey into the rift, noting how proximity to the center distorted time and reality. He hinted at Angela Shu's role in guiding him, though Angela dismissed his claims as absurd. He showed them his map of the multiple versions of Gideon Falls. He then revealed a strange, machine-like contraption, stating that the only way forward was to show them the truth. As the Pentoculus whirred and croaked and thundered into being, innumerable versions of Gideon Falls from the multiverse were displayed in front of Fred and Dr. Shu. At the hospital, Norton stood by his father, Doc Sutton, who expressed his longing, saying he had missed Danny deeply. Norton, struggling with his fragmented memories, wished he could remember more about their past together. Doc shifted the focus to Clara, expressing his love for her but lamenting her inability to confront the truth. He believed that she would never grasp the reality of their situation, despite the evidence around her. Turning to Norton, Doc proposed they work together to escape their circumstances, emphasizing their shared understanding of the mysterious forces at play. Meanwhile, Clara met with Sheriff Ballard and a technician who had surveillance footage from her father's room. The technician admitted he couldn't make sense of the events but replayed the recording. The video showed a nurse entering the room. Suddenly, Doc Sutton grabbed the nurse, and at that very moment the screen glitched. As the glitch went away, the video showed another doctor entering the room. The nurse, now acting possessed, attacked and killed the doctor as Sutton watched in horror. Clara and the sheriff were horrified by the footage. Clara remarked on her relief that her father wasn't responsible, but Ballard's attempt to comfort her fell flat, leading to a tense exchange. At the hospital parking lot, a man approached the possessed nurse, who was walking aimlessly. Concerned, he asked if she was okay. The nurse, her eyes glowing unnaturally red, uttered, "Open." As the man tried to understand her meaning, she grabbed him, forcefully opening his mouth and unleashing a torrent of insects into his body. Clara pursued the possessed nurse, who was kneeling in a parking lot. Clara aimed her gun and demanded the nurse surrender. The nurse, hands bloodied and trembling, appeared disoriented and asked, "What have I done?" Clara echoed the question, her voice laced with unease. Elsewhere, the man affected by the nurse's earlier attack exhibited bizarre behavior while driving. He picked a cockroach from his chest and ate it with eerie calmness. His reflection in the rearview mirror revealed the sinister visage of the laughing man, its glowing red eyes and twisted smile hauntingly clear. Despite this, the man continued driving, seemingly under the laughing man's influence. Fred and Dr. Shu faced a wall of monitors displaying alternate versions of Gideon Falls. Fred questioned his role in the unfolding chaos, asking the bishop why he was chosen for this mission. The bishop acknowledged Fred's repeated failures but commended his resilience, emphasizing Fred's ability to find light in the darkest moments. The bishop affirmed Fred's importance, explaining that his perseverance made him the right choice for this task. He also told Angela her involvement was no coincidence, calling it a destiny. Fred expressed concern about navigating the multiverse's complexity, asking how they would find their way back. The bishop reassured him that the answer lay within himself, encouraging faith and belief. The monitors and red outlines symbolized their path forward as the bishop urged them to embrace their roles in the fight against the laughing man. Meanwhile, Clara regrouped with Sheriff Ballard and the team. They informed her that her father, Doc Sutton, and Norton were missing. While Clara grappled with the situation, Doc Sutton and Norton resolved to gather allies, mentioning a group called the Plowmen as their next step in confronting the escalating supernatural threat. Chapter 3. Alone in the Dark. At a roadside diner, the man possessed by the laughing man entered and was greeted warmly by the waitress, who encouraged him to sit wherever he liked. He politely thanked her and sat at the counter. Nearby, another customer enjoyed a meal. The man eyed the customer's hamburger hungrily and, without hesitation, reached over to grab it. The customer protested, but the man drowned the hamburger in ketchup, ignoring him. When confronted, the man's only response was an unsettling smile, repeating how hungry he was. Meanwhile, Norton and Doc Sutton hurried through the streets, with Doc urging Norton to keep up despite concerns about his health. Norton warned that Doc needed to slow down due to his his heart, but Doc dismissed the concern, insisting they needed to find shelter and clothing quickly. As they moved, Norton grew uneasy about being seen, but Doc maintained optimism, declaring they were close to answers. The two ducked into an alley to avoid police sirens, with Doc assuring Norton they hadn't been spotted. Norton pressed Doc for answers, asking what they were close to finding. Doc, filled with determination, expressed confidence that with Norton back, they could finally uncover the truth about the Black Barn and the sinister forces tied to it. He revealed a shard of dark material, hinting at its connection to their goal. They arrived at the library, where Doc reassured Norton not to worry about Clara, confident she could take care of herself. Inside, they were greeted by Janet, an acquaintance of Doc's, who greeted Norton warmly, noting his resemblance to Doc. As they entered deeper into the library, Doc introduced Norton to the Plowmen, a secretive group determined to combat the evil tied to the Black Barn. Doc explained Norton's significance to their mission, emphasizing his first-hand connection to the barn. Duncan expressed disbelief about Danny being Doc Sutton's son, questioning if any proof, like a DNA test, had been obtained. Janet dismissed his skepticism, pointing out Danny's resemblance to Doc. Doc intervened, urging the group to set aside their arguments and focus on the imminent threat from the Black Barn. He revealed that the barn had used him to escape and was now free. Doc emphasized that this was the moment they had all been preparing for, calling on the group to stand together to stop the barn's influence. Clara confronted an officer about her father's disappearance, frustrated that she had explicitly asked them to watch him. The officer struggled to respond, but Clara cut him off, stating she would handle it herself. But the officer stopped her and mentioned that something bad had happened at the diner. Walking into the rift, Fred and Angela found themselves in an ominous, red-lit environment, their surroundings engulfed in fractured imagery. Fred reminded Angela of the importance of staying together, urging her to trust him and take a leap of faith. Angela, disoriented and struggling to comprehend the situation, followed reluctantly, voicing her fears and discomfort with the oppressive atmosphere. Their connection strengthened as they held hands, walking through the shifting space. Fred reassured Angela, emphasizing the need to remain calm and stay united. Angela's panic began to subside as Fred asked her to share her story to distract her from the dread. Angela revealed that she was born in Gideon Falls to immigrant parents who had worked tirelessly to support her. She described her father's dedication to sending her to college and how she eventually opened her own medical practice, dedicating herself to her work. Taking Norton as her patient had been a turning point, ultimately leading her to this strange reality. Their conversation brought a moment of calm, but the oppressive darkness soon closed in. Disturbing sounds echoed around them, forcing Fred to take charge and guide Angela away from an unseen threat. A terrifying sensation of pursuit gripped them as shadows and noise pressed closer. Fred shouted for Angela to move faster, urging her toward a faint light in the distance. As the sounds intensified, Fred yelled for Angela to run, their connection becoming the only anchor in the chaos. The looming threat forced them to focus on the distant light, sprinting toward it with desperation. The relentless tension climaxed with Fred's determined cry, pushing them forward as they clung to hope amidst the terrifying void. Fred and Angela found themselves atop a cliff overlooking a vast expanse of nothingness, with the ominous sound "critch" echoing around them. Angela nervously asked Fred if he saw what she was seeing. In the distance, a massive, twisted, otherworldly creature emerged from the black void, its form resembling a surreal tangle of limbs and spines. Angela whispered, "Dear God," as Fred shouted for them to run, warning her not to look back as they fled from the growing menace. At the Plowmen's gathering, a heated discussion erupted. Reg, incredulous, questioned how the events in the Black Barn could make any sense, prompting Jane to scold him for his language. Danny recounted his experience, describing a strange machine inside the barn, though he struggled to remember the details. Jane theorized that the Black Barn might involve multiple dimensions or even a connection to a spectral plane. Duncan expressed skepticism, insisting that the barn had always been a paranormal phenomenon rather than a technological one. As the group debated, Danny speculated that Norton Sinclair might have built the machine to release the entity trapped within the barn. They were led to a hidden room, referred to as the Plowman's Clubhouse. Inside, they discovered shelves filled with equipment and an arsenal of weapons. Reg declared that their purpose had always been to stop the evil from the barn. He proclaimed that this was their chance to hunt and kill the entity and destroy the barn once and for all. Despite lingering questions about how to locate the creature, now loose in the world, the group steeled themselves for the confrontation, united in in their mission despite the uncertainty that lay ahead. Meanwhile, Clara approached the diner with determination, ordering officers to cover the back alley and maintain a presence outside. An officer hesitated, questioning if Clara should enter alone, but she dismissed the concern, instructing him to watch her back. With her gun drawn, she entered the diner, the bell above the door ringing faintly. Inside, blood dripped from the counters and covered the floor, where bodies lay motionless. Among the carnage, the possessed man knelt, visibly shaken and covered in blood. His voice trembled as he muttered, I was hungry," revealing the depth of his despair and horror. Chapter 4. Drink the Dark Water. Fred and Angela continued their journey through the forest. Fred questioned whether they should keep moving, and Angela hesitated but admitted they had no other option, placing their trust in the bishop's plan despite growing doubts. Fred confessed his concerns that the bishop's knowledge might not align with their intentions. Angela expressed her own confusion, agreeing that none of it made sense anymore. Fred admitted he no longer knew what to believe. Angela shared her disorientation, likening their current reality to an overwhelming and surreal experience. She reflected on her former trust in science, now shaken, comparing it to Fred's wavering faith in the church. Both acknowledged that their respective beliefs had failed to prepare them for what they were encountering. As they walked, Fred noticed something ahead. Angela crouched by a small water source and wondered if it was safe to drink. Fred warned her against it, but Angela's curiosity led her to touch the water. Suddenly, the reflection of the laughing man appeared in the water, shocking Angela. Shadows erupted from the water, pulling Angela in despite Fred's frantic attempts to stop her. Fred screamed as Angela was dragged into the abyss. He managed to grab her hand just in time, pulling her back to safety. Both collapsed on the ground, shaken. Angela trembled, muttering about what she had seen. Fred urged her to get up as the ominous critch sounds grew louder around them, the forest darkening with an overwhelming presence. The monstrous roach-like creature ran after them. Fred's panic set in as he shouted, "Oh Jesus, run!" urging Angela to flee. Meanwhile, at a diner-turned-crime scene, the possessed man, bloodied and disoriented, confessed, "I was hungry," as officers apprehended him. Clara, visibly shaken, held him at gunpoint. The man claimed he was manipulated by the man with the smile, who coerced him to act, demanding Danny in exchange for ending the chaos. Clara's emotions boiled as she struggled with the weight of the man's words. Outside, Ballard approached Clara as she sought a moment to compose herself. Ballard voiced disbelief over the man's claim about Danny, dismissing it as insanity. Clara, overwhelmed with guilt, confessed that Danny's earlier abduction as a child was her fault. She felt the current events were retribution and feared losing him again. Her desperation reflected her helplessness against an overwhelming force targeting Danny. Back at the ploughman's hideout, Reginald armed himself, frustrating Janet, who criticized his obsession with weapons. Danny rejoined the group, admitting he no longer knew who he was, but suspected the Black Barn was tied to him. Duncan speculated they could use Danny to lure the entity, though Doc Sutton vehemently rejected the idea of using his son as bait. Danny, torn by the Black Barn's grip on his life, resolved to confront it, expressing his longing to escape its influence and reclaim a normal life. In a vulnerable moment, he addressed his father as Dad, a rare show of connection, leaving his father visibly moved. Duncan broke the moment of reflection by emphasizing the urgency of action, reminding everyone that every delay cost lives. Danny's father deferred the decision to him, acknowledging the gravity of the choice. Danny, despite the fear and weight of responsibility, stated he could locate the Black Barn, claiming an innate ability to find it. However, Reginald pointed out the recent reports of a deadly incident at Nanka Park Mall, suggesting it could be their starting point. Outside, Ballard reacted swiftly to the news, coordinating efforts to secure their surroundings and plan their next steps. Clara was ordered to stay behind to manage the scene, but she refused, insisting on accompanying him. Frustrated yet resolute, Ballard conceded. The ploughman prepared to confront the looming threat, with Danny visibly resolved, holding a block of C4, declaring, "Let's end this." Elsewhere, in a disorienting forest, Fred and Angela fled from the nightmarish creatures that surrounded them. Angela, struggling to process the horror, muttered, "This isn't real. This can't be real." Fred urged her to keep running and avoid looking back. Their path became perilous as arrows began raining down, striking the monstrous insects in their wake. Seeking cover, the duo ducked for safety, bewildered by their surreal predicament. Emerging from the chaos, a group of tribal figures wearing masks approached. approached, armed with bows and spears. Their leader ordered them to stand down, introducing themselves as the village at the center. They escorted Fred and Angela to a hidden settlement, describing it as the village at the center. Addressing Fred as father and Angela as mother, they alluded to a larger purpose while the two wrestled with confusion and dread. Angela asked why they called her mother. A known voice said from behind, "Because that's what they call me." A woman with white hair and a mask greeted the group, saying, "Hello." Angela recognized her and reacted with shock, stammering, "You're," to which the woman confirmed, yes, it was Angela herself, but old. The old Angela immediately pressed on the urgency of the situation, asking her younger counterpart, "We have little time. Are you ready?" Angela, confused and wary, questioned, "Ready? Ready for what?" The woman fixed her gaze on Angela and gravely replied, "To die." Chapter 5. The Eater of All Things. Emergency services responded to a catastrophic incident at Nanka Park Mall. Clara and Ballard, leading a team, arrived to find chaos. An officer, visibly shaken, stammered that the situation inside was horrible. Clara steeled herself, determined to investigate. Ballard, armed and resolute, pledged his support, and the two entered the building. Inside, they confronted a grotesque reality. A pale woman, drenched in blood, stood atop a pile of mutilated bodies. Possessed by the one who laughs, she exuded an unnatural menace. Ballard muttered, "Hell, this is hell," as they watched the gruesome massacre. The woman, grinning malevolently, taunted them. "Hell, you haven't seen anything yet." At the village near the center, the group was led by an older Angela, now called Mother Shu, who urged them to act quickly. She guided Fred, Angela, and the others as the village came under attack by massive insect-like creatures. Villagers fought valiantly but were overwhelmed. Mother Shu led the group to the Pentaculus, a machine resembling the bishop's creation, and revealed its critical importance. She commanded her followers to activate it, preparing for an imminent confrontation. As the chaos escalated, Fred and Angela shared a desperate exchange, struggling to comprehend the unfolding horror. Before they could act, an insect struck Mother Shu, piercing and killing her. The group stood in shock, witnessing her sacrifice. Meanwhile, Clara and Ballard confronted the bloody woman, telling her not to move. Clara demanded answers, but the woman responded cryptically, "Go ahead and shoot." Without warning, she twisted her own head, snapping her neck in a final, defiant act. As the woman died, an insect came out of her bleeding mouth and entered through the ear of another hostage. The hostage came to life and taunted them, declaring that he won't stop until he got Danny, and everyone knew that. As it leapt toward them, Clara and Ballard fired, but the creature remained undeterred. It lunged, brutally attacking Ballard, leaving Clara in shock as she called out to him. The creature overpowered Ballard and unleashed a barrage of insects into him. Clara tried to warn him, but it was too late. The grotesque transformation left Ballard lifeless, overtaken by the malevolent entity. The creature pointed the shotgun at Clara and in a sadistic tone mocked her inability to protect those she cared about. The entity taunted Clara further, vowing to destroy everyone unless its demands were met. Clara, lying helpless on the ground, listened as it declared its intentions, vowing to consume the world until it got Danny. With defiance, Clara responded, shouting that it would never have him. Suddenly, someone with a crowbar struck down Ballard. It was Danny, accompanied by his allies, the Ploughmen. Clara, seeing him, called out his name in relief. Danny reassured her, stating he was ready to confront the entity. The creature, now more menacing, growled its willingness to take Danny. At the village, Angela cradled the dying Mother Shu, who urged her to carry on the mission. Mother Shu explained that the group needed to reunite for the final confrontation. Angela hesitated, but Fred pulled her away, emphasizing the urgency. As they moved, they saw reality splintering, with red shards fragmenting around them. Mother Shu's voice echoed in Angela's mind, promising that the group's actions would determine their fate. As they entered the bleeding void, Fred reached out, telling Angela to trust him and take his hand as the world around them collapsed into chaos. Danny confronted the Laughing One, demanding to know why he was its target. The Laughing One, grinning maliciously, called Danny special and suggested they could achieve greatness together. The black barn materialized as it beckoned Danny forward, claiming it represented limitless possibilities. Clara pleaded with Danny not to submit, but Danny negotiated with the Laughing One. He agreed to abide by its rules if it left Clara alone. The Laughing Laughing One smirked and accepted, drawing Danny closer. Clara, alarmed, shouted for it to leave Danny alone, but Danny urged her to duck as chaos erupted. Duncan opened fire, shattering the Laughing One's head into a swarm of insects. Reginald, filled with rage, called out to Danny as the group braced themselves. Sutton charged toward the barn, clutching a mine. In the fray, a roach leg impaled Reginald, killing him instantly. Another leg lashed out, piercing Sutton's shoulder, leaving him injured. Clara screamed in anguish while Danny, frozen by the escalating violence, hesitated in shock. The Laughing One mocked Danny's hesitation, threatening the lives of those he cared for. Danny wrestled with his sense of responsibility toward Clara, while feeling drawn to the Laughing One's promises of ending the suffering. As Danny approached the barn, the Laughing One gloated, claiming his journey had always been inevitable. Extending a roach leg, it prepared to impale Danny's throat. A gunshot suddenly rang out, obliterating the leg. Fred, standing firm with Angela, had fired the shot. He declared, "These are my people, my parish. Time to get the hell out of here." The Laughing One tried to strike Fred, but its leg passed through him as if he weren't there. Bewildered, the Laughing One faltered. Fred, unwavering, declared that because he didn't believe in its power, it couldn't harm him. The Laughing One ridiculed him, calling him a dog. Fred smirked and admitted, "I'm a dog who just keeps getting back up." Clara and Sutton supported each other as they approached a cart filled with C4, both determined and visibly battered. The Laughing One stood before the black barn, arrogantly claiming that Danny and it would be together. Clara, holding the detonator, shouted to get its attention, calling it an asshole and accusing it of losing focus. With a grim smile, she clicked the detonator. The C4 exploded in a massive eruption of fire and debris, engulfing the black barn in flames. The Laughing One screamed in fury, its form fracturing and splintering into chaos. It demanded to know what Clara had done, its voice a mixture of rage and disbelief. The destruction of the barn triggered an immense reaction. Reality itself appeared to warp as pieces of existence shattered and fell apart. A giant, abstract structure resembling a book twisted and broke apart, scattering fragments and pages across an endless void. The energy from the explosion spiraled outward, forming surreal and chaotic patterns in the surrounding space-time continuum. Pages of existence flipped and tore, as if the fabric of the world was unraveling. The remnants of the Laughing One's domain collapsed into an empty void, leaving only fragmented pieces floating in the vast, silent expanse. Act 5. Wicked Worlds. Chapter 1. What's that flying with the crows? A public warning was issued against the presence of dangerous cockroaches, part of the Laughing Man. Citizens were urged to call the authorities immediately if spotted. A man, holding a sign declaring, "The end is here," ranted about the fall of morality and divine justice, blaming humanity for the chaos. He was apprehended by local enforcers for violating secular state laws, though he desperately pleaded that the situation was beyond repair. Angela Shue reflected on her surreal circumstances. A robotic drone issued instructions for curfew compliance, emphasizing control and surveillance. Angela, uncertain of how long she had been in this distorted version of Gideon Falls, observed the oppressive environment marked by heightened paranoia. A knight, a strange and anachronistic figure, suddenly charged forward, screaming about madness and black magic, further adding to the disorienting chaos. Suddenly, the knight was shot down. As Angela was herded by enforcers with a group of civilians, she witnessed acts of violence and desperation. After confirming her identity, the enforcers ordered her to move to Transient Camp 6. She complied, but continued to process her confusion. She realized she had to focus on grounding herself amidst the madness by thinking of her past connection to Norton and how her life had unraveled since meeting him. Her memories spiraled back to the origins of the chaos. She recalled how Norton, who was actually Daniel, carried the seed of this madness, linking them to the Black Barn and its devastating emergence. She remembered their efforts to work together to destroy the Black Barn. Angela questioned the reality of her experiences and became concerned about what had happened to the others. As dawn broke over a barren desert in another Gideon Falls, Clara ventured forward alone. She was accompanied by ever-watchful drones, which had somehow come to that reality from Angela's Gideon Falls. Her journey led her to an abandoned town where she knelt to drink water. She discovered cockroaches floating in a water basin. She inspected them warily, realizing they might be connected to the Laughing Man. Her unease grew as she spotted more cockroaches cockroaches gathering on the side of a nearby building. Alarmed, she turned to see the insects multiplying, forming an ominous sight that elicited a gasp and an exclamation of disbelief. Her journey took her to a grim execution site. A tree served as gallows where bodies were piled beneath a hanged figure. A crimson stream of blood flowed from the pile, its path leading toward the ground, where cockroaches scurried within the macabre trail. As Clara ventured further, the tension rose. She sensed someone approaching and turned to see a man in a black cowboy hat, his steps marked by the crunch of dry dirt. His ominous greeting, paired with his unsettling presence, unnerved Clara. He questioned what a woman like her was doing alone, his tone laced with menace. The man laughed, and a sound came. "Critch!" Clara realized the man was possessed. Startled, she attempted to escape, her instincts propelling her into a sprint as fear gripped her. Elsewhere, in a rain-soaked, neon-lit, futuristic Gideon Falls, Fred wandered through crowded streets. A woman offered him companionship for a price, but he declined, drawing scornful remarks about fleeting pleasures. He moved on, his destination unclear, until a vision of the bishop reminded him of his purpose: to find him when he got there. Arriving at the church, Fred questioned its sanctity. The robot priest greeted him, revealing the church charged fees for worship, confession, or private audiences. Fred, unable to pay, was dismissed. Outraged, he questioned the integrity of such a place. The priest coldly responded, "This is Gideon Falls. Everything costs something in Gideon Falls." Fred got out of the church. A lady greeted him as sweetheart and suggested they get back to business. Fred, however, asked for advice on earning 20 credits quickly, stating he was new to the area and in need of guidance. The woman mockingly suggested niche markets or selling his blood, but scoffed at his apparent lack of modern mods or nanotech enhancements. Frustrated by his naivety, she dismissed him, leaving Fred disheartened. Seeking answers, Fred turned to a robotic street vendor, which curtly directed him to a blood bank, warning him off with a sharp threat when he pressed for more details. Overwhelmed, Fred found himself alone, drenched and desperate, questioning his purpose and the surreal world around him. He did not understand his purpose and felt lost. He suddenly saw a heap of trash by the end of the street. He ran towards it and started rummaging through the trash, and he found a nail. It was the debris of the black barn. Suddenly, a cowboy-like figure emerged, startled and muttering in shock. Suddenly, there was a disastrous sound. Meanwhile, Angela Shue reflected on her travels across multiple dimensions. Seated in a makeshift shelter, she sketched images of the black barn, her mind revisiting the many iterations of Gideon Falls she had encountered. Her voiceover revealed her belief that the black barn was the nexus of the worlds, the dark center of all realities. As she contemplated this, the same explosion rocked her surroundings. Peering outside, she saw what was going on. Reality had gone crazy. A piece of the Gideon Eye building broke off and fell through Angela's dimension into Clara's dimension. She whispered, "Why? Why is this happening?" Bishop Burke appeared before her and said, "Because, Angela, you didn't destroy the black barn, you set it free." Chapter 2. Neon Bible. Fred wandered the neon-soaked streets of the dystopian Gideon Falls, his frustration growing as he navigated its grim reality, where even basic survival demanded resources he didn't possess. After unsuccessfully seeking assistance, he encountered a floating ambulance that announced the implementation of molecular cleansing in the area. Intrigued and unsettled, Fred questioned locals about the ongoing earthquakes. A man explained they had started 3 days earlier, triggering Fred's realization that his arrival coincided with these events. This revelation strengthened Fred's belief that his presence was tied to the chaos. In search of sustenance and resources, Fred learned about a blood bank in the area and decided to try his luck there. At the facility, the staff's disdain for his lack of familiarity with their system was evident. A technician explained that unmodified blood, like that of Fred's, commanded a high price. He was surprised. When Fred expressed interest in selling his blood, the technician hesitated, acknowledging the rarity of his condition. Ultimately, Fred demanded a higher price for his blood, negotiating his way to a lucrative deal. Armed with newfound resources, Fred returned to the church he had visited earlier, this time with the required payment. The masked priest, admitted him into the cathedral, leading him to a peculiar, high-tech chair. Fred questioned the nature of the setup, seeking answers about the bishop. The priest instructed him to jack in, explaining that the chair would connect him to the system. Despite his skepticism, Fred complied. As Fred engaged with the system, he found himself immersed in a surreal, digital environment. The setting was a warped parody of confession and worship, dominated by advertisements and avatars. Overwhelmed, Fred realized that it was a sex cathedral, far from what he had expected. He unplugged himself and questioned the attendant, demanding clarity. The attendant confirmed that the setup was part of a sex thing, mocking Fred's assumptions about it being a place of genuine worship. Infuriated, Fred demanded his money back, but the attendant dismissed his outrage, stating there were no refunds. Frustrated and disillusioned, Fred wandered the streets, venting his anger. Molly, the woman he had interacted with earlier, approached him. She noticed his newly acquired funds and teased him, suggesting he found a way to obtain the money. Fred hastily defended himself, denying any unsavory implications. Molly shrugged it off, offering no judgment. As they walked, Molly mentioned the ongoing quakes and expressed her unease. Fred agreed, sharing in her apprehension. Before parting ways, Fred unexpectedly offered to buy her dinner, a gesture that surprised Molly. She hesitated, citing work obligations, but Fred insisted, offering to pay for her time. Reluctantly, she agreed. During their meal, Fred attempted to explain his background and his confusion about the city's distorted norms. Molly, initially skeptical, listened as Fred described his search for a true cathedral and his desire to contact his boss. Molly revealed her awareness of floating cities and hinted at systemic segregation between those above and below. She admitted her limited understanding of Fred's world, but appreciated his sincerity. Their conversation was interrupted when Molly's robo-pimp chastised her for wasting time. As Fred tried to stop the robo-pimp from hurting Molly, it launched a small rocket that hit Fred in the left eye, destroying it. As Fred clutched his bleeding eye, Molly shouted at the robo-pimp to stop. Suddenly, a man was thrown at them. Dazed, Fred exclaimed, "Jesus!" and looked up to see a grotesque figure, a man with a mechanical arm and a disturbingly wide grin, his red eyes glowing. The figure greeted him with a chilling "Howdy!" and mockingly asked, "Who wants a kiss?" before grabbing Fred. As Fred struggled, the man pried his mouth open, insisting Fred would like it. The man leaned in, vomiting a swarm of cockroaches directly into Fred's mouth. Fred's muffled screams faded as the insects overwhelmed him. Outside, Molly and others noticed the chaos as monstrous figures with similar wide grins emerged from the shadows. Molly yelled for Fred, urging him to run, but the horrific creatures began surrounding them. The city descended into madness. Fred regained his senses, his face bloodied and his vision blurred. Molly tried to pull him to his feet, urging him to move. Explosions echoed in the distance and the ground trembled violently, sending people and structures tumbling. Molly slipped and nearly fell into a gaping chasm, but Fred caught her hand just in time. She pleaded for him not to let go, her voice filled with desperation. Straining, Fred pulled her to safety as chaos erupted around them. They scrambled away from the collapsing terrain, the ground splitting under the weight of the destruction. Blimps floated ominously above the city skyline as Fred and Molly paused, catching their breath. Molly, stunned by their surroundings, muttered, "Where the hell are we?" Fred, equally shaken, replied, This is Gideon Falls." Chapter 3. All the best cowgirls have daddy issues. Amid a desolate desert landscape, the broken head of the Gideon I building loomed against the horizon. Clara, panicked and muttering expletives, searched her surroundings for a weapon. Inside a nearby shack, she retrieved a revolver from a holster near a bloodied and lifeless body. Bracing herself, she confronted an approaching figure, an undead attacker clad in a tattered red shirt. As the creature lunged, she fired multiple shots, taking it down, its body slumping to the ground. Relieved but unsettled, Clara observed the gory aftermath before hearing ominous sounds approaching. A line of menacing, undead gunslingers appeared on the horizon, their skeletal faces grinning as they marched toward her. Determined to survive, she prepared to defend herself, firing at the advancing group. Despite her efforts, the bullets seemed to have no lasting effect, the undead figures barely flinching as they pressed forward. Realizing the futility of her attack, Clara turned turned and ran, evading gunfire and scrambling through the chaotic environment. Her flight brought her to another shelter where a young girl called out, directing her inside a barn. Together, they hurriedly barricaded the door, securing it as the undead closed in. Clara and the children, Emma and Jasper, barricaded themselves in the barn, trying to delay the approaching undead gunslingers. As the thuds against the barn walls intensified, Clara asked the children for ideas. Emma suggested climbing to the loft, prompting them to rush upward. However, Clara realized their position was still precarious, with no viable escape route. Emma, desperate to leave, proposed jumping from the loft, but Jasper hesitated, clinging to the hope their parents would return to save them. Clara firmly told Jasper that their mother was gone and staying behind would lead to their demise. She tried to calm him, explaining that while she was also scared, they had no choice but to act. Emma supported Clara, scolding Jasper for his reluctance. The situation grew dire as the attackers broke through the barn's defenses. Clara urged Emma and Jasper to jump while she provided cover with her revolver. Emma and Jasper hesitated, but eventually leaped to safety and landed on the next roof. Clara held her ground, firing until her ammunition ran out. One of the undead creatures grabbed at her, but she managed to evade its grasp by climbing and leaping through. While she leapt, she saw the tears in reality. It was as if she journeyed through different versions of the same place before landing on the next roof. As they planned their next move, Jasper declared he couldn't keep running as he had sprained his leg. Emma pointed out the nearby livery stable, suggesting there were horses they could use to escape. Clara immediately took charge, helping the group descend the roof carefully. Once on the ground, they encountered more danger, including undead figures pursuing them relentlessly. As they made their way to the livery, Emma hesitated, haunted by a glimpse of her undead mother among the attackers. Clara sternly reminded her that her mother was gone and that they needed to focus on survival. The group continued their escape, but chaos ensued when a zombie lunged at Clara, pulling her to the ground. She fought it off, landing a decisive kick to its jaw. Meanwhile, Jasper was grabbed by another zombie. Emma screamed in defiance. Right then, there was another earthquake. Everything shook to the core. Clara grabbed that window and kicked the zombie that had grabbed Jasper. As they fled toward the livery, Clara spotted the corpse of the sheriff. She took out his gun and ran with the kids. Inside the livery, they found several horses. Clara asked Emma if she could ride, to which the girl affirmed. Clara decided Jasper would ride with her for safety. Mounting the horses, they prepared to leave when a shadowy figure entered the barn, prompting Clara to draw her gun. The figure raised his hands in surrender, pleading with Clara not to shoot. Clara threatened to kill him if she saw any signs of the bugs that had plagued others. The man reassured her, "It's just me." The man walked into the light. It was Doc Sutton. Stunned, Clara lowered her weapon, whispering, "Dad!" Chapter 4. Are you feeling sinister? Bishop Burke narrated the history of the multiverse to Angela in the ruins of Gideon Falls. The multiverse began as a singular entity, the One, containing all light and all dark, embodying perfect order and unity. Over time, a division emerged, and the darkness, driven by insatiable hunger, began consuming and spreading. This shattered the order and gave rise to dualities and multiplicities, with one becoming two, then four, and continuing infinitely. As light and dark intertwined, life was born and spread across new worlds. Each world mirrored the others, forming infinite versions echoing endlessly. At the heart of it all was Gideon Falls, a peculiar nexus where the boundaries between realities were thinner and the darkness stronger. Norton Sinclair's machine, built within the infamous barn, enabled him to gaze into the infinite expanse of Gideon's. Something dark and sinister, however, responded to his gaze and smiled back. In the beginning there was the One, and in the end too there would be one. That one would be a version of Gideon Falls. In the end there will only be the center. He explained that destroying the Black Barn had set off a chain reaction, collapsing the multiverse inward toward its center. This event freed a dark entity that Norton's machine had once tethered. The entity now roamed untethered, searching for a permanent host, her world's Norton. Bishop Burke told her that her world's Norton was actually Daniel Sutton. Angela, alarmed, struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what had happened and where the others were. Father Burke revealed that their only hope lay in gathering the 5 travelers to combat the chaos unleashed by the collapse. When Angela asked how he had found her, Bishop Burke cryptically replied that she had told him where to look. Right then, Bishop Burke and Angela were confronted by a hovering robotic entity that issued a loud warning about a Violation 26, declaring Gideon to be a secular state under surveillance. 2 enforcers in red-visored helmets approached, arresting Bishop Burke for wearing contraband. Angela tried reasoning with them, pointing out the chaos caused by recent earthquakes, but they coldly insisted that Gideon must watch. One of the enforcers restrained Angela, while the other struck Burke with a baton. As Burke collapsed to the ground, the atmosphere grew more intense. Suddenly, a zombie woman with distorted features and sharp teeth emerged, brutally attacking the enforcers. She had been overtaken by the Laughing One. One enforcer screamed in terror as her claws tore into him, her grotesque face twisted in a sadistic smile. Burke urged Angela to run while chaos erupted around them. The zombie continued her rampage, tearing into the enforcers and ominously declaring, "This is the end." Other zombies joined the fray, one of them pinning Burke to the ground and unleashing a swarm of insects onto him. Angela struggled to comprehend the chaos, trying to fight off the encroaching zombies. Burke, injured and desperate, insisted that she flee. As the dark presence consumed him, Burke's face grew pallid, his eyes began to glow red, and his voice took on a chilling distortion. The Laughing One's sinister laughter echoed through him, mocking Angela's resistance. Burke's transformation became complete, revealing a grinning visage with jagged teeth. He ominously whispered Angela's name, urging her to leave. Then, the Laughing One's voice spoke through him, expressing its desire for Angela. Burke, under the entity's control, tried to rip off her mask to unleash the insects onto her. Angela grabbed a nearby tire and swung it with all her might, striking Burke in the face and knocking him to the ground. Then she ran and took cover. Angela crouched, catching her breath, as a hovering robotic entity buzzed around her, repeatedly declaring, "Gideon is watching." Her frustration and exhaustion were evident as the device malfunctioned, sparking and emitting static before shutting down. Glancing up, Angela noticed someone fleeing in the distance, a fleeting figure disappearing into the shadows. Angela followed the trail and arrived at a decrepit building marked with a sign reading 171 Delaware. Above the entrance, an ominous slogan warned, "Gideon Falls watches you." She hesitated briefly before proceeding, the weight of recent events still heavy on her mind. Inside, she encountered a man who greeted her with a calm demeanor. He acknowledged her arrival, expressing relief that she had made it. Overwhelmed, Angela stammered as she tried to explain the loss of Bishop Burke, but the man interrupted, assuring her that Burke had always known this was his fate. His words carried a tone of eerie inevitability. Angela, still processing the events, threatened to punch him if he claimed she had foreseen this outcome. The man dismissed her remark with a hint of humor and led her deeper into the building. Revealing a hidden area, he gestured to a massive, ominous machine glowing with red orbs. He declared it was time to gather the new plowmen, signaling the beginning of their next mission. Chapter 5. It's time to play. In the dystopian era Gideon Falls, Angela, visibly shaken and confused, demanded answers from the group surrounding her. She pleaded for clarity, overwhelmed by the chaos and uncertainty. A shirtless man reassured her, insisting she already knew what to do, even if it didn't seem apparent yet. He told her that their current course of action required patience and faith, emphasizing that waiting and praying were their best options. Angela, frustrated, asked, "Pray for what?" The composed man in a suit interjected, explaining that Bishop Burke, known as a traveler, had created way stations across various worlds of Gideon Falls to prepare for the inevitable collapse. As the group discussed their next move, Angela proposed activating the equipment to find Norton and Fred and put an end to the unfolding disaster. The suited man, however, reminded her of the complexities, admitting they didn't know where Norton and Fred might be or whether they were even together. He added that their plan hinged on others finding similar way stations in different worlds and activating them in time. He warned that the collapse of all worlds had already begun, with everything converging toward the center. Meanwhile, in the old Western-era Gideon Falls, Clara reunited with her father, Doc Sutton, in a desert landscape. She anxiously inquired about her brother and Fred, but Doc Sutton had no answers. Clara insisted they move quickly, but Doc Sutton, showing his age and exhaustion, doubted his ability to ride. Despite his condition, he reassured her he was capable comfortable and asked if she still had ammunition. They prepared for an uncertain journey, riding off into the harsh desert sun with Emma and Jasper. In the steampunk era Gideon Falls, Molly and Fred engaged in a tense exchange. Molly, clearly disoriented, questioned how this could be Gideon Falls, insisting it was different from the one she knew. Fred explained it was indeed Gideon Falls, but not the same one she came from. Frustrated, Molly demanded clarification, and Fred admitted his own confusion, stating he could barely understand the situation himself. He added that trying to explain it would be futile, as it defied logic. As they spoke, Molly pointed out how chaos seemed to follow Fred's arrival. Fred, nonchalant, attributed it to his gift. Before they could continue, Molly was struck by a sudden, fearful sensation as someone screamed in the distance. Turning to the commotion, they saw a grotesque figure, a laughing entity in a top hat, approaching, followed by others like it. Fred shouted for them to flee, but right then, Molly pointed out a church where Fred wanted to go. Fred and Molly approached the towering church amidst the chaos in Gideon Falls. Fred, clutching his wound, suggested that Molly might want to go her own way, hinting that whatever he might find inside could be dangerous. Molly, defiant and with no alternative, refused to leave, asking where else she could possibly go. Fred warned her, his tone grave, before pushing open the door to the ominous structure. Meanwhile, under a serene, star-filled sky, Clara, Doc Sutton, and the others rested by a campfire in the desert. Jasper, the young boy, slept peacefully despite the day's terrors. Clara marveled at the resilience of children, though Doc Sutton noted that the trauma they endured often manifested later. Clara, feeling guilt, apologized to Doc for never believing his stories about the Black Barn and the horrors tied to it. Doc admitted that their lives had always been chaotic and lamented losing his son Danny once again. Clara tried to reassure him, but doubt lingered in her words as she speculated whether her obsession with the barn had caused the current tragedy. Their respite was interrupted as Jasper awoke, sensing something amiss. Clara and Doc tried to dismiss his concerns, but the tension grew palpable. Jasper insisted that something was approaching. The group prepared themselves as Clara, holding her gun, identified the sound. Horses were coming. Back at the church, Fred and Molly stepped into its eerie silence, searching for something unknown. Molly sarcastically remarked on their unclear objective, while Fred shushed her. Their tension deepened when they spotted a figure kneeling at the altar. Fred called out to Bishop Burke, only for the grotesque figure to turn, a horrifying visage that mocked their hope. The possessed bishop declared, "I knew you would find me, Wilfred. We have been fools," sending chills through both Fred and Molly. Burke attacked Fred, claiming he couldn't let him leave after finding the way. Fred begged him to stop, pleading that he could help, but Burke's mind was consumed by darkness. Burke taunted Fred, accusing him of past sins, including Rebecca's death, which he blamed entirely on Fred. Burke's words cut deep, reopening old wounds, but before he could do more harm, Molly acted. She killed Burke with the embedded sword in her hand, saving Fred just in time. As his lifeless body hit the ground, Molly reminded Fred that Burke was no longer the man he once respected. She urged him to focus, asking what they needed to find in the church. Suddenly, there was another dimensional quake, and structures from another reality fell into the church. As the structure around them trembled violently, massive gears and cogs materialized. Fred pointed to a strange, glowing object in the distance, identifying it as their ticket out of here. It was the Pentoculus. Meanwhile, Clara and Doc Sutton rode through the desert with the children, desperate to find safety. Clara noticed something familiar, a diner hoarding from their world, a sign they might be home. Sutton confirmed it was Hap's diner, his expression both hopeful and cautious. He understood that his version of Gideon Falls had also started appearing in their reality. He deduced that he needed to get home, because if Danny was in that reality, he would always head home. Meanwhile, the Pentoculus was switched on in two realities, the village and the steampunk Gideon Falls, and the dimensions began to converge as fragmented images of their experiences collided. Clara and Sutton entered their room, but did not find Danny there. Fred and Molly appeared at the village near the center as reality started to build itself together. Angela asked Fred where Danny was. He said that he had no idea. They understood that Danny was not there and wondered where he was. Inside a cave, Danny came to his senses. He looked in front and saw Joe Reddy. He was sitting atop a pile of bodies. He had murdered all of the bishop's disciples, axed them to death. He was still holding the bloody axe in his hands. Joe smiled a sinister smile and said, "Well, there you are. It's about time you woke up. It's time to get started." Act 6. The End. A chilling transformation began with an ominous black dot expanding into larger forms, signaling an impending shift. Danny, disoriented and struggling with fragmented memories, awakened in darkness. His trembling hands grasped a mask, and he tentatively called out, "Dad?" Shadows deepened around him as he moved through an eerie, oppressive environment. A laughing, grotesque figure emerged, its sharp teeth glowing ominously in the dim light. Danny's panic grew as his surroundings warped and twisted, dragging him into a nightmare. The grotesque man leaned closer, radiating menace as Danny desperately tried to retreat. His outstretched hand reached for stability, only to find more chaos waiting. A fiery explosion erupted, consuming the black barn. Flames roared as the structure collapsed, marking a pivotal and catastrophic moment. The barn's destruction left behind a haunting vision, its stark red and black silhouette lingering with an overwhelming sense of dread. In front of the barn stood the real Norton Sinclair. Danny ran, stumbling through an otherworldly red landscape, shouting "No!" Swinging, his voice echoed in the oppressive environment. He ran through a distorted forest, the ground shifting beneath him with every step. The sound of the insects were following him. The eerie crimson light around him heightened his growing panic. Muttering, "Impossible! It's impossible!" He grappled with the bizarre reality unraveling before him. As he emerged from the forest, the surreal redness faded into a muted, desolate landscape. Exhausted, he trudged along a ridge, his breathing laboured. Looking down, he saw a seemingly tranquil coastal village nestled near the water. Despite the calm scenery, a foreboding sense lingered. Reaching the edge of the settlement, Danny was confronted by three masked figures: a man wielding a staff, Jasper, a young woman with a bow, Emma, and an older woman draped in a flowing white garment, Molly. All of them had aged with time. Jasper greeted him, saying, "Hello, father." Danny, baffled, asked where he was and what was happening. Jasper, speaking on behalf of the group, revealed, "We are your children, and we have been waiting a very long time, waiting for you." Danny's expression was but a mix of disbelief and dread as he tried to process their cryptic words. This was before Fred and Molly came to the village at the centre, from the steampunk-era Gideon Falls. At present, Fred and the group arrived at a massive, eerie machine surrounded by glowing red orbs. He demanded to know the whereabouts of Danny and the others. Molly, disoriented and, speaking from her experiences, described being alone in a strange, futuristic version of Gideon Falls that was crumbling into chaos. Fred connected this to the destruction of the Black Barn, which he believed had initiated the collapse of multiple worlds. Angela delivered the grim news that Bishop Burke was gone, prompting Fred to express sorrow and determination, vowing that the bishop's death would not be in vain. Molly expressed concerns about lingering in the area, citing instability. Angela introduced herself, clarifying her role, while the group debated their next move. Fred stated that Norton and the others likely wouldn't know to find similar way stations. Angela agreed, calling the situation futile due to the sheer number of collapsing worlds. Fred, however, insisted he knew where everyone would end up, home. Saying this, they prepared to be transported to the present-era Gideon Falls, where Clara and Sutton were. Meanwhile, Clara and Doc Sutton waited at Sutton's house. Clara shared her disappointment at Danny's absence, revealing a hope that he would have returned there. Sutton reassured her that change was inevitable, acknowledging Clara's newfound patience and determination. When Jasper's injury was brought up, Sutton, in his warm yet rugged manner, assured the children he was capable of helping. Doc examined Jasper's injured leg, reassuring him that the wound, though painful, wasn't severe. He promised that cleaning it and applying medicine would alleviate the pain. As they conversed, Clara reflected on her own childhood, comparing Jasper and his sister's bond to her relationship with her brother. She admitted she had once been protective of him, but with a tinge of regret, she acknowledged that she eventually stopped. Suddenly, a dimensional quake startled everyone in the room. Clara instinctively told them to hold on as the tremor passed. Clara tried to calm everyone, but Jasper pointed out something unusual. Clara turned to see cockroaches crawling ominously along the walls. Alarmed, she ordered everyone to step back. A second tremor followed shortly after. As Clara looked outside, she noticed reality getting fragmented, other multiverses collapsing in. She asked her father if he still had his hunting rifle, sensing the need to prepare for what was approaching. Sutton asked what was wrong. Outside, grotesque, grinning figures with glowing eyes emerged from the shadows, amplifying the dread as Clara grimly remarked, "Bad stuff, Dad, really bad stuff." Before, Danny walked in the village near the centre. Danny asked, "What is this? Where is this?" Jasper explained that they had been waiting for him for a long time. Danny, still disoriented, demanded answers, but received only cryptic responses. They led Danny deeper into their settlement. He noticed the eerie atmosphere and remarked on the presence of the Laughing Man. The group confirmed they were near the centre of the Black Barn's influence, claiming it had always led him there. Despite Danny's protests, insisting that the Black Barn had been destroyed, the group calmly explained that its presence was inevitable and that they had been preparing for his arrival. Reaching a construction site, Danny saw the framework of the Black Barn being rebuilt. The villagers explained they were reconstructing it, claiming only a few pieces were missing. Danny grew agitated, shouting that this was wrong and they shouldn't be doing it. He pleaded with them to stop. Emma said that it was important and Angela Shue knew it. She explained that Angela Shue had died but would return soon. Emma assured him that everything happening, no matter how wrong it seemed, was what was supposed to occur. Overwhelmed, Daniel called the situation insane, suggesting it felt like a dream. Before he could piece things together, a loud, dimensional quake erupted, disrupting their conversation. A surreal and catastrophic landscape unfolded. A mirrored skyline appeared upside down, split by fiery explosions and smoke. The group realized they were witnessing the convergence of realities. A green face projected on a massive structure loomed ominously as chaos unfolded around them. As the gates of the village fell, monstrous figures with hollow eyes and grinning mouths swarmed. Their leader, Joe Reddy, wielded an axe and commanded his forces to attack, declaring, "Take them all!" Daniel and Emma tried to react as the horde advanced, but the situation quickly became dire. Joe singled out Daniel, ominously referring to him as a special boy, indicating he was of particular interest to the Laughing One. At present, Fred, Molly and Angela were transported to Gideon Falls beneath Fred's church. As the Pentoculus hummed, Fred angrily commented that Burke's machine had been beneath them the entire time. Upstairs, Molly pointed out the zombies outside. Fred donned his goggles and prepared to take his old car for a ride. In the house, Clara and Doc Sutton faced the monstrous invasion. Clara ordered her father to take the children upstairs for safety while she remained to fight. Armed with a shotgun, she shot several creatures but was quickly overwhelmed. Clara found herself in mortal danger as the monsters closed in, screaming, "No!" Right then, Fred crashed his car into a group of the infected, sending bodies flying. Clara, shocked, questioned him as he ordered everyone to get in. Inside the car, Clara demanded to know their destination. Fred curtly replied they were heading to the church, leaving no room for debate. He intended to use the Pentoculus. At present, Danny awoke in a cave, greeted by Joe Reddy, who mocked his tardiness and declared it was time to play. Joe forced Danny to his feet, reminding him they were running out of time. When Joe asked if Danny knew who he was, Danny admitted he didn't. Joe revealed his name and said that he used to be his bus driver. He predicted his own grim future, stating that he would die in Gideon Falls after fully becoming an agent of the Laughing Man. Joe led Danny through the woods, where he ranted about his devotion to the Laughing Man. Joe's frustration boiled over as he lamented being overlooked in favour of Danny, whom he bitterly called the Special One. Trying to appease him, Danny apologised. Joe dismissed the sentiment, claiming they were nearing their destination, the Laughing Man's domain. They stood in front of the lake, filled with insects. Joe directed Danny to jump through to the centre. Meanwhile, Emma and Jasper regrouped at the village. Suddenly, their Pentoculus hummed with power. Fred, Molly, Clara, Sutton, young Emma and young Jasper had just been transported there. Emma revealed Daniel had been taken into the woods by the infected. Clara immediately wanted to go and rescue Daniel. She insisted she would go alone, but Sutton refused, taking responsibility for past failures. He admitted his guilt over losing Danny years ago, vowing not to let Clara face the same fate. Moved by his words, Clara hugged him. Molly decided to stay behind with the children, ensuring their safety, while Clara, Fred, Sutton and Angela prepared to confront the infected. Determined, Clara armed herself with a shotgun and declared they were ready to proceed. 4 of the 5 had gathered: Fred, the priest, Angela, the doctor, Clara, the soldier, and Sutton, the father. Now they had to save the prophet, Danny. Fred, Clara, Angela and Sutton advanced through a desolate forest. Fred checked on Angela, who admitted she no longer considered herself all right. Reflecting on her past, she confessed feeling responsible responsible for Daniel as her patient, viewing him as different and pitiable. Now, she saw herself in Daniel, realizing her own sickness and isolation mirrored his. Fred empathized, suggesting their shared pain made it essential to face the challenge together. The group reached a clearing where Clara decided to press on to find her brother, ignoring Angela's warnings about the horrors she had glimpsed in the water. Fred expressed his conviction that their journey was part of a greater purpose. He spoke of renewed faith, something he hadn't felt in years. Clara, resolute, led the way into the dark abyss. Angela stayed behind as the others jumped right in. The ground beneath them shifted and the group plunged into an otherworldly expanse. Emerging in an inverted realm, their reflections hung eerily above the surface as they ventured deeper into the unknown. They reached a desolate red wasteland as the sky darkened. Clara noticed Joe ready with her brother Danny and furiously shouted for him to back away. Joe taunted her by saying he had been defeated before but still stood. Fred warned the group, sensing the approach of an immense danger. Clara approached Reddy, but before she could act, he struck her, initiating a fierce altercation. Fred intervened to defend Clara, wrestling with Reddy and managing to briefly disarm him. Joe shook him off and took out a knife and slashed Clara in the face. Fred ran and punched Joe in the face. However, Joe came back and head-butted him and broke his nose. During this window, someone picked up the pocket knife and stabbed Joe in the neck from behind, killing him. It was Angela. She sat in front of Danny and told him that she had followed him. Suddenly, an enormous cockroach-like entity emerged in the distance, its silhouette casting an ominous shadow. Fred urged everyone to move quickly, realizing the severity of the threat. They swam back to the surface. There, Clara, Danny, and Doc Sutton embraced each other. Their family was together again. But right then, Angela pointed out something in the distance. Danny ominously said that they had broken the surface and the laughing entity was coming out. As reality crumbled around them, the laughing monster rose from the waters, its gaping mouths ready to devour everything in existence. As reality splintered, Danny pointed out that the black barn was the only thing that was holding the entity within. He said that the barn still existed and it was calling to him. He held a piece of the barn in his hand and concentrated, and all of them were transported in front of the barn. Danny decided to go inside, saying, "I have to, it wants me, let him come and get me." Clara, distraught, refused to let him go and pleaded tearfully. Fred and Doc Sutton intervened, deciding they would not let Danny face the danger alone. Fred declared, "We all go together, we stay together. It goes through all of us." The group, united in purpose, held hands and ventured forward into a red void. The door of the barn closed behind them. As they proceeded, their connection began to falter. The oppressive presence within the void started to distort their surroundings, shattering the individuals into fragmented pieces as though they were being consumed or erased. Despite Fred's plea to hold on, the sinister entity mocked them, saying, "Together, there is no together. Don't you know that by now?" Danny was now isolated, surrounded by floating shards of memories and realities of his friends. Voices taunted him, repeating, "You are all alone. You always will be." The atmosphere grew increasingly menacing as Danny was confronted by his deepest fears and regrets, amplified by the malicious entity's influence. As the reality around him collapsed further, he encountered distorted images of his companions and the haunting memories of their losses. The monstrous entity loomed over him, pushing him toward despair. Danny said that he had always been scared, but now he was not. He extended his hand and broke through the red wall. A staircase-like structure appeared, spiraling through fragmented dimensions. He walked through every nook and corner and found Fred. He led to the others, and then he entered another door. He had travelled back in time and appeared at that very instant when Norton Sinclair was about to switch on the Pentoculus. He stopped him and warned him to not turn on the machine. Meanwhile, Fred rescued Sutton, Angela, and Clara from the despair chambers of the maze. Sutton, determined, told Clara that they were going to get Danny back. Danny stood in front of Norton and cautioned him not to switch on the machine, as he did not know what he was doing. Norton said that he was not going to let Danny ruin his life's work. Right then, Norton hit the switch, and the Pentoculus started humming with power. Danny punched Norton in the face and pinned him down to the ground and strangled him. The voice of the laughing one echoed, "My boy, my beautiful boy, kill him. It all starts with death. It all ends with death." The others arrived. Danny stood up and apologized to them, saying that killing Norton was the only way to stop him. He broke down on Clara's shoulder, saying that he didn't mean to. Clara pacified terrified him as the pentaculus started raging louder, radiating otherworldly energy. Father Fred insisted. "We have to shut it off." Clara hesitated, questioning what destroying it might mean for them. Angela warned, "If we stop this from ever happening, it will change everything, maybe even us." Doc Sutton looked at Clara and Danny. They said, "Do it." Sutton took an axe and cut a rope that connected to a crane hook. The hook dangled and hit the humming device, and all reality splintered. An array of life choices and memories flashed, with Danny at the center of it, and then everything cut to a white, blinding light. Reality reformed as the warm sunlight shined down on Danny's masked face. Clara noticed his distracted expression and asked, "Are you still with me? You seem distracted." Danny admitted he'd had a strange feeling, as though he had forgotten something important that slipped away when he focused on it. Clara empathized, joking it was a sign of getting old, though Danny teased her, saying she wasn't old. She laughed, mentioning her dad's talk of past lives and old souls. Danny reflected on their father, remarking, "Dad means well." Clara reminded him to visit their father, mentioning he'd noticed Danny's absence. Danny promised he would. As they walked through the park, Clara suggested taking a break, her feet aching. They sat on the bench, and Clara asked, "How are you feeling? I mean, really?" Danny reassured her, saying he felt good, though his tone hinted at lingering unease. Clara expressed concern about Danny still wearing his mask and seeing Dr. Shu, the therapist Father Fred had recommended. Danny admitted the mask made him feel calmer and that Dr. Shu was helping him, or so he thought. Clara smiled and reminded him it was her job as his big sister to worry about him. As Clara prepared to leave, she reminded Danny about Sunday Mass, and he promised not to forget. "Bye, Danny," she said as she walked away. Danny replied softly, "Bye." Left alone, Danny's expression grew somber. The scene became surreal, with red hues overtaking the reality. He walked to the trash can and pulled out a sharp, black shard, a piece of the black barn. It beckoned him, as if to build it again. As he examined it, his reflection merged with a monstrous, grinning visage, marking the ominous end of the saga. Marvelous verdict. That's it for today, folks. As we close our deep dive into the haunting, reality-bending tale of Gideon Falls, we want to thank you for journeying through the dark corridors of the Black Barn with us. But rest assured, if the Black Barn ever appears in any reality, the Longreads multiversal crew will be there to unravel its mysteries and bring the story to you. If you enjoyed this video, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Share them in the comments section below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay connected with our multiverse-spanning explorations. Till then, let the Lord be our shepherd.